Hold on. Yeah, today I am actually changing it up a bit. Streaming in the just chatting because this is going to be mainly more geared towards watching videos on specific topics. Um, Specifically, I want to start it off with the with just overall, honestly, overall any topics regarding socialism because I just came out from a chat and it's just constantly the same shit repetitively repeated over and over and over. What about this? What about this? So this I'm gonna go through a couple more of these. We've done this before, but I think I want to actually start off with like another Q&A from a Discord server with a lot of questions. This is a 2-hour video. Um, and honestly,
All right.
let's see what we got.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Hakeem. I
Yeah.
am a
Okay,
political
so
Marxist. I run a channel named Hakeem, as you may expect, where I apply Marxist analysis and critique to current events, as well as discuss theory and other
okay.
sorts of
And
things.
also I logged
Hope
into
that's
Ark
a
as it's
short
turning
enough
nighttime, so that's cool, I
introduction of
fucking
myself.
guess. What got you in? Wait.
Sure thing. What originally got me into Marxism is I come from a slightly left-leaning family, but nobody in my family was directly Marxist. But I just generally had like anti-imperialism and so on and so forth kind of ingrained in me as a child, but loosely. There wasn't actually any theoretical education. Oh boy, how neat! Can you guys hear me now? All right. Just let me know if I cut out so that I can just repeat myself. So yeah, really got me into Marxism was reading originally. I used to be, especially when I was younger, but I still am, but especially when I was younger, I used to really be into modern history, particularly World War II history. And just through studying it, I realized there's this thing called the Soviet Union, and they were different than the other countries because they followed this thing called Marxism, in particular Marxism and Leninism. And I was intrigued. I was like, what could this be? And then I decided to, go and read the texts, and that kind of, started my path towards being a Marxist. And I've been a Marxist for almost a decade at this point. The person I would idolize the most, I would say, there are two figures. It's Ernesto Guevara, better known as Che, and also Thomas Sankara, who was the leader of Burkina Faso in the early 80s. These two people are the figures I tend to hold closest to my heart, personally. So yeah, my entire point is it's Che Guevara and Thomas Sankara. These are the two people that I admire the most.
Okay, hold on. Maybe I will start off with a different video. What? No, we gotta watch this one. How do you feel about the use of cultural Marxism in the US by the government and the media to subvert the people? This is an absolute bullshit question. What the fuck? I hope he just laughs this one off.
Sorry to burst your bubble. There is no such thing as cultural Marxism.
Let's go.
Cultural Marxism as a concept, it evolved.
Bruh.
The idea that there's such a thing as cultural Marxism evolved out of the fascist conspiracy that used to be called Judeo-Bolshevismus, which means Jewish Bolshevism. That somehow morphed into what is now known as the Frankfurt School of Marxism, which basically just applied critical
I
theory to
don't need to
capitalist
do this.
society. It has nothing to do with direct influence. It's essentially a meme. There's no Marxist, or quote-unquote cultural Marxist conspiracy to take over the U.S. Um, American universities are not breeding grounds for Marxism. More so, actually, if somebody who's more, let's say,
Where am I?
I don't want to use the word close-minded usually, but if somebody goes to university and then comes back with far more progressive beliefs, that may be because they were exposed to many different ideas and particularly many different people from different backgrounds, and that might be the cause of that, not some insidious plot to subvert or the good God-fearing
Very
American
true.
youth. But yeah, there is no such thing as cultural Marxism per se, and the best example of this was in the debate between Peterson and Zizek, where Zizek asked Peterson, name me a cultural Marxist, and Peterson just essentially was dumbfounded. He could not respond. So yeah, that's my response as well.
What's the next question though? Okay. Um. We are gonna go through the death toll of capitalism. Um. God, I swear to God, there was one. Was he not the one that debunked the Black Book of Communism? Okay, well, let's do this one right now. Oh fuck. Bam.
Why do people play the numbers game? It's dehumanizing and doesn't hold very well as an argument on its own. Stripped of its nuance, it's simply a number
lagging.
to be regurgitated as an attempt to stop a conversation before it even begins. However, it's something we have to deal with. In my personal experience, one of, if not the most frequent objection to socialism that I've heard is, socialism killed 100 million people in the last century. It's uttered almost reflexively, as if it isn't a thought that one came up with on their own, but one that is almost taught to be shot back at a moment's notice. The figure comes from a work, notorious in its unreliability, called The Black Book of Communism. Now, we can go through each instance mentioned in the book and provide the nuance necessary to not only explain the number, but also arrive at a correct figure, be it higher or lower, usually much, much lower, than mentioned in the book. There might be some merit to that. Better yet, why don't we turn the argument on its head? How about capitalism's death toll? First of all, we need to define our terms. What exactly makes the system we currently live under capitalism? Well, it's simple. Unlike the propagandizing sophistry of some economists and other types, capitalism can be clearly defined by the existence of 1. Markets, 2. The private ownership of the means of production, and 3. Wage labor. Before some guy
they can actually get on here?
tries to correct me, I'm talking about the scientific definition of these concepts, not the colloquial terms. Capitalism is a global system, and as a result, these factors exist, with few exceptions, globally. How does capitalism function? Primarily on one single concept, the drive for profit, the profit motive. For a capitalist to be successful, he has to beat out his competition by the most ruthless methods in order to secure as high a profit as possible to further develop their business. Kind-heartedness won't get you anywhere in this game. What this means, in essence, is that if it doesn't make you money, it isn't worth doing. Providing safe drinking water? No point. Vaccinations? A money pit. Housing? Why bother? Privatizing water sources, kicking poor people out of cheap housing to build luxury condos, defunding healthcare, now that's profitable. This directly results in millions dying across the planet every year as a direct result of capitalist policies. Malnutrition kills over 3 million children each year. Factor in as thousands every single day. This isn't because we don't produce enough food, we do. In fact, we produce far more than we currently need, even when we factor in the massive waste of food that occurs in highly industrialized countries, again, as a direct result of capitalist policies. It isn't even because we don't have the distribution systems, we have that too. And for the places that lack it, it could very quickly be developed. Just look at how quickly mining and fuel companies get to the deepest and most isolated parts of our Earth for that which will make them money. The reasons that thousands of children die each and every single day is because it isn't profitable to save them, to treat them, to house them, to feed them. Similarly, and equally sad, is the situation with drinking water. Over 1 million people die each year because of lack of access to clean drinking water. Not only in Yemen or Mozambique, but even in the richest country on earth, the ever-free United States of America. Again, not because we can't provide clean drinking water, but because it isn't profitable to do so. The situation with preventable illnesses is equally dismal. Tuberculosis causes 1.5 million deaths yearly. Pneumonia kills 4 million. Malaria kills 500,000. This isn't mentioning other common illnesses like hepatitis or other vaccine-preventable diseases. We're talking easily over 6 million deaths each year because it's more profitable to invest and distribute acne and foot fungus cream than it is to provide vaccines and antibiotics to those that don't have much capacity to pay for it. Being conservative, that's
I could
10
probably put one on
million
an
excess
alpha
deaths as
platform.
a result of capitalism each year. That figure is actually low, in fact, as I'm not factoring in imperialist wars, intentional destabilization of governments due to either the lobbying or the direct intervention of corporations, or governments especially friendly to corporations, IMF restructuring of governments, and predatory loaning forcing austerity on populations worldwide, and on and on. These alone can raise it to 15 million, 20 million, or even higher. At this very conservative and very incomplete figure of 10 million a year, within a decade, capitalism kills more than socialism ever has, assuming socialism killed that many in the first place. Within a century, it can go as high as 1 billion deaths, possibly more. Immediately, the argument falls apart. No matter what way you try to twist it, capitalism is, by its very inbuilt components, a bloodier system. Again, I want to reiterate that this is all just food for thought. This is a moral argument, and I'm not particularly fond
I don't
of
like
moral
this.
arguments. Capitalism can be attacked with far more powerful blows in, for example, commenting on its inbuilt instability, or its falling rate of profit, or its
There we
boom and
go.
bust cycles, or the extraction of surplus value, on and on.
It's not this one. I want the other one.
Once all this is said, though, here come the excuses. It's corporatism, not capitalism, yells one corner. Well, I made a video on that, and you can check it out in the link in the description. Another corner yells out corruption, bad business practices, bad management, which equally doesn't hold any water as an argument. It is a good question, though. Why are these things a result of capitalism exactly? Capitalism requires new markets. Capitalism results in winners in the competitive sphere, resulting in monopolies. Capitalism results in capitalists acting in their own interests, lobbying governments to put in legislation that favors them directly. It's good for business to keep third world countries underdeveloped, or overexploited, as this is a more accurate term. That way you can keep extracting resources cheaply, and exploiting the labor also equally cheaply. It's good for business to suppress workers' movements, that way you can keep wages low and working hours long. It's good for business to care for profit over need. Not only is it good, it's necessary. This all results in the stagnation of wages, at the very least, as is the case in the US today, or the forced depression of wages to as low as they can get, as is the case worldwide. This results in neocolonialism in the guise of the IMF or different countries like France or the US, political destabilization for capitalist gain in poor third world countries, with the United Fruit Company being the prime example, or even outright military invasion in the cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, to name just a few. The cases are endless. All of these things happen in order to secure resources, secure markets, and secure quote-unquote friendly governments that will give preferential treatment to the Exxons, Nestle's, and Teslas of the world. If you uphold capitalism, you must logically also uphold all that capitalism requires to function, be it unemployment, imperialism, environmental destruction, inequality, and exploitation. All of this results in poverty, the degradation of infrastructure.
Tracking and reconciling business expenses across multiple systems can be disjointed. But with travel banks end-to-end
Infrastructure and limitations on the access of education, housing, and healthcare. In essence, excess death as a result of our beloved capitalist system. The cruel joke is that the system needs this. It is an inbuilt feature, not a fluke. Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, it doesn't matter. It still happens and will continue to happen unless the system is dismantled. This takes me to another point. Everything you hear about socialism, more or less, is capitalist projection. Workers work in monotonous, lifeless housing. They work dead-end jobs where they have no control over their workplaces. They live in a dictatorship where they have no political say and a distant group of elites run everything. Socialism killed millions. Not only is it projection, but those that promote capitalism, when confronted with this information, will try to shift responsibility by every other excuse.
Yep.
Corruption, corporatism, bad management.
Well, that's not real
individual
capitalism.
action rather than the system itself. Damned be the evidence. What of the Black Book of Communism, then? The number of 100 million can realistically be traced only to this academic work, and I use those words loosely. Other than that, you see it in a few niche neo-Nazi sources which claim 100 million, 150 million, even much more in some instances. I think it's fair to dismiss those right off the bat. So why is the Black Book problematic? Well, how about a quick fire round? They count Nazi deaths in World War II as part of communism's death toll. This point alone is enough to condemn this book to the trash can. Not only this, but they count other things, like civilian deaths that occurred as a result of the American invasion of Vietnam, through some strange logic, as part of the death toll of communism. Rigorous academics, these authors are. Two of the main authors have admitted to having far lower estimates, nearly half as much as the widely publicized 100 million mark. So why publish under the sensationalist 100 million figure? It includes people who weren't born as deaths, because, that makes sense. Basically, fertility rates went down in, for example, a famine. A woman who would have had 4 kids now only had 2, because, again, having more kids in a famine is a bad idea. Those 2 kids that could have been born, but never really existed, victims of communism. I hope you see how fucking ridiculous this is. I recall somebody doing something similar with US fertility trends just for the meme and got something like
take this
4 or
140.
5 million excess deaths. It'd be hilarious if it weren't taken seriously. Outright invention of numbers, sometimes even throwing on 10, 20,000, or even 5 million deaths on a number just to be safe, practically pulling numbers out of their ass, unsourced of course. Counting pogromists that would round up and murder Jews, rightfully punished by the Soviets, as victims of communism, oh boy. And finally, the nail in the coffin is that 2 of the 3 main authors publicly distanced themselves from the book, saying that Courtois, the main author, had an unhealthy obsession with getting to the 100 million number. Again, evidence be damned. It's a propaganda piece, plain and simple, and funnily enough, it only reinforces how stupid of an argument it is. To quote Chomsky, supposing we now apply the methodology of the Black Book to India, that democratic capitalist experiment has caused more deaths than in the entire history of communism everywhere since 1917. Over 100 million deaths by 1979, and tens of millions more since, in India alone. If you're interested in a more detailed dive into the sad excuse of a book, take a look at Revolutionary Left Radio's episode on it. I've linked it in the top comment. The sooner we put this nonsense to bed, the sooner we can be bombarded by other tired arguments of the anti-communists. Human nature. Hopefully, once those are satisfactorily dealt with as well, we can move on to an actually productive discussion. Or not. Bad arguments seem to never die. Pity, because the victims of capitalism continue to do so. And that's all for this time. If you enjoy my videos, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Joseph Nicholson, Morgan Amol, Violet XD, Daniel Hyman, Zero Adams, Andrea CC97, ASDF, FDSA, Ansies3, Zach, Zachary L. Petrovsky, D-Lop, Vegan Comrade, Ramal Bedier, Caleb Reeves, Aaron Bongdi, Ides of Marx, Biblaridian Fan, Abdullah Thut, Gonzalo,
Bro, he's hitting me heavy.
Set, Sam Korth, Rima, Big Dummy Jack, Huge Ass, Princess Charlotte, William Hargis, Alex Dexheimer, Comrade Saul, Anarcho-Marxist, Richard Scott Wigton, Lee Gloucester, JC Diaz 547, Faisal Hussein, Ryan Hodgkinson, Samir Sarkar, Anix Magnus, Patrick Mansouri, Philip Corrales, Jenny Enox, Comrade R, Alexander Shendi, Wild Bill, Brandon Vergara, A Comrade, At Southern Marxist, Close Sniper, Colin Morgan, Because Butts, Alex Bookbinder, Alex Benishek, Comrade Goat, D. Lang, Darius A. Birdhall, John Bernstein, John Poland, Noel, Nobody, Paul Luders, Pauline McDeesey, Rocco, Rose Hogginson, Scott Radburn, Alan Plum, Brandon Persuade, Coach Cinnamon T, Comrade Benito, Comrade Pengu, Dal McFarlane, L.A. Garzon, Eugene Simonovsky, Farrah Tahan, Garlic Bread, Grammar Antifa, Granola Joe, Industrial Robot, Wes, Chongjia Hu, DV Gold Gamer, Philistakes,
Holy shit!
Spooky Scary Socialist, Jordan Follows,
Get out!
Kyle Rapp, Liam Sapanen, Libertarian Stalinist, Mass Strike Now, Matt, Michael Reddy Webster, Namratha Prabhu, Natalie Taylor, Ahmad Abdul Jabbar, Parker Cushing, Ring, Rudy, Sid Singh, Sussy M, Ted Teddington Tedsville, Toki Mukai, Tristan Druyan, Veral Dor, Zatarani, and Zarin Arson. Thanks for watching.
Snap your W-2 and file Fed and State for free. Simple tax returns only. See if you qualify.
And others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support my channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. If you live in the US and you turned on the news during the week of July 11th, 2021,
Bro, you need
were
to
met
stop.
with breathless wall-to-wall coverage of supposedly massive anti-government protests in Cuba. If you went on Twitter, you were inundated with hundreds of nearly identical tweets about freedom or how the
Bro.
Cuban people don't want the brutal US sanctions to be lifted, all from accounts created within the previous week. Some of the news footage does indeed show large gatherings, but as we should all know by now, the American media is notorious for twisting the truth. What's really going on in Cuba? And why is the United States government so obsessed with the island nation? In this episode, we'll examine the reality of the protests and take a look at the long history of US intervention in Cuba. Just over 200 years ago, in 1820, Thomas Jefferson called Cuba, quote, the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states. He went on to say that the United States ought, at the first possible opportunity, to take Cuba. For over 2 centuries, the American ruling class has had its sights set on Cuba, the island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This began during the period in which America had become obsessed with the notion of manifest destiny, the idea that American settlers were destined to expand the borders of the empire, originally within the confines of their own landmass, but eventually growing to include places in the farthest corners of the earth. And Cuba, due to its proximity to the United States, was among the very first targets. Cuba's history with the United States is long and complex, but at its core, it boils down to some very simple goals. The United States wanted a captive market for American-style capitalism, and Cuba produced a huge amount of sugar, something which was very valuable to those who held the keys to the industry. After Cuba's war for independence from Spain, the United States initiated a military occupation, amended the Cuban Constitution to make it dependent on the US, and established Cuba as a neo-colonial holding. American capital flooded into this new and untapped market, setting up lucrative private enterprises and exploiting the local workers and resources. By 1950, US companies controlled 90% of Cuba's electric and telephone services, 70% of the arable land, 2/3 of the island's sugar production, and 50% of the railways. Only 3% of Cuban farmers owned the land they worked. Quality of life under American colonial rule was abysmal. Nearly a quarter of the population was completely illiterate. Life expectancy was just 59 years, and infant mortality was 60 per 1,000. Fast forward a bit, through years of exploitation by American businesses, gangsters, and the US-supported Batista dictatorship, and it should come as no surprise that revolution was inevitable. For a full recounting of US-Cuba relations and all the fascinating details of the Cuban Revolution, I highly recommend you check out Season 2 of Blowback. They're not a sponsor or anything, it's just one of the best podcasts I've ever listened to, hands down. I've left a link in the description and it's well worth your time. For brevity, suffice it to say that the Cuban revolutionaries, led by Fidel Castro, eventually succeeded in defeating the Batista regime, even with their US support, and establishing a government that actually worked for the people of Cuba, rather than their American overlords. Illiteracy was eradicated through education programs, life expectancy increased, and the infant mortality rate plummeted. Today, Cuba enjoys a longer life expectancy than the US, and a lower infant mortality rate, despite 60 years of brutal US sanctions which make it extremely difficult to trade with other nations and acquire medical supplies. That brings us to the embargo.
With my low energy, I can't finish this trending dance.
Join Planet Fitness.
I got
for
it in.
just
I got it in.
$10 a
That's all that
month
matters.
And find your big fitness energy with the equivalent of a judgment-free zone.
For 6 decades now, the US has done its very best to crush Cuba's economy. Those in power claim that it's all in the name of human rights, but anyone with even the slightest knowledge of history will know that's not the case. We'll get to that argument shortly. But first, if you're skeptical about the original intent of the blockade, here's an official document from 1960 outlining the recommended actions to cause the collapse of the new Cuban government. This document could not be more explicit. It acknowledges the fact that Castro had majority support, It points out that there was a high likelihood of communism becoming even more popular in Cuba, and it spells out in plain English that the only way to stop this trend is to make Cubans suffer. It says, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. But they don't stop there. The document goes on to say, it follows that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. There you have it. From the US government themselves, a secret campaign to ruin the lives of Cubans, to cause starvation, poverty, and misery, so that the United States could reestablish their brutal colonial rule. In more recent years, calls to end the 60-year blockade have grown. As of the last vote, every single UN member state, with the exception of the United States and Israel, has condemned the blockade as immoral, inhumane, and completely uncalled for. Despite this fact, the blockade remains in place, and the Biden administration has even announced that they will subject Cuba to further sanctions. That brings us to the recent protests. US officials wasted no time in using small, isolated, anti-government protests as an excuse to condemn Cuban leadership, increase economic pressure, and even threaten military intervention. Biden and others have taken to wagging the finger at the Cuban government for their handling of the protests, which is intensely ironic considering the US police and unidentified paramilitary forces brutalized protesters, ran them over with cars, and even kidnapped people and drove them off in unmarked vans during last year's police brutality protests. We have no room to talk when it comes to police interacting with protesters.
We really don't.
The US sanctioning of Cuba over, quote, repression of protests less than 1 year after the most brutal government crackdown on the largest protest movement the US has ever seen should be telling. The United States does not care about human rights, nor does it apply the same standards to itself that it sets for other nations. But let's talk about human rights for a moment. Then we'll get to the protests themselves. The US is currently calling for investigations into Cuban human rights abuses, while blocking the International Criminal Court from investigating their ally Israel's war crimes. For example, just a few weeks ago, Israeli forces used live ammunition on Palestinian protesters, and Biden didn't even mention it. Israel's treatment of Palestinians has been far, far more brutal and inhumane than arresting a handful of pro-US agitators. Israel's crimes include bombing roads, hospitals, and houses, displacing people whose families have spent entire generations in those homes, and making sure Palestinians can't get clean drinking water, medical supplies, or construction materials to rebuild after the bombings. Of course, the US will never mention this. What about incarceration? US officials love to claim that Cuba is an undemocratic dictatorship. But let's compare records, shall we? Florida was recently ranked the freest state in the US, whatever that means. I'm sure it has nothing to do with the United States trying to cast the closest bit of land to Cuba as its direct opposite. But, in a lovely bit of irony, if Florida were its own country, it would incarcerate a larger percentage of its population than any country on Earth. In second place would be the United States, a country where 74% of prisoners are being held without ever being charged with a crime. This statistic makes it extra despicable when the president
Let's
tweets
go.
things like, I condemn the mass detentions and sham trials that are the Cuban regime's efforts to threaten the Cuban people into silence. Come on.
Okay, hold on.
We wrote the book on mass incarceration and show trials. The United States has the largest prison population, both by sheer numbers and per capita, of any country in modern history. But the US doesn't just operate overcrowded prisons within its own borders. The US also runs an illegal torture complex in Cuba to this day, Guantanamo Bay. As a matter of fact, the first Guantanamo inmate, Abdul Latif Nasser, was just released in July. He had been cleared for release all the way back in 2016, over 5 years ago, and had suffered for 19 years in the American torture prison, without a single charge ever being brought against him. Can you imagine that? Being locked away in a foreign country, not seeing your family, friends, or even your homeland for nearly 2 decades, without ever being charged with a crime. There are still 39 prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. Only 11 of them have ever been charged with anything. It should be very telling that the worst treatment of people in Cuba comes not from the Cuban government, but the American one. Okay, so the US is hypocritical about incarceration and treatment of protesters, but we still help where it counts, right? We must send aid or something to these noble protesters fighting for freedom. Well, no. In fact, President Joe Harm Reduction Biden is increasing harm again by slapping even more unconscionable sanctions on Cuba. US treatment of Cuba is so obviously cruel and inhumane that other nations are ignoring the blockade and sending much-needed aid to Cuba themselves. Mexico has sent ships full of food and medical supplies to help stave off preventable deaths from disease and starvation. Deaths that would not occur without the blockade. That's what caring about the Cuban people really looks like. If the US really cared, we would lift the blockade. We would let the Cuban people determine their own future. But we won't. So if it's not about human rights, what is it about? Let's talk about color revolutions. A color revolution is typically a private-public collaboration between big business and state departments or intelligence organizations with the aim of fomenting political unrest and regime change in target countries. Luna Oi has a couple of good videos explaining the topic more thoroughly. But suffice it to say that the color revolution has been a staple in the US imperial toolbox for a very long time. So, how do you spot one of these phony, often astroturfed protest movements? There are a handful of key components that give them away. The first, and most obvious, is the inclusion of symbols friendly to the imperial power sponsoring the movement. In the case of the recent Cuban protests, note how many protesters are wearing or carrying American flags or English slogans. Also worth noting are the slogans themselves.
This might
They're
die.
often vague, generic expressions, typically including words like freedom or liberty, words that are guaranteed to elicit a reaction in American viewers, as we saw happen in places like Miami. Color revolutions often tend to be small, especially in places like Cuba, which have so much support for their existing government. And these anti-government protests were very small, despite the US media's attempt to spin them as massive crowds. The giant gatherings we so often saw on TV were actually counter-protests in support of the Cuban Revolution and the government. Here's a video of 100,000 people coming out to say, no, we don't want US meddling. These agitators do not represent Cuba. Because of this massive disparity in size, mainstream media outlets took to using devious means to convince people the color protests were larger than they actually were. Misleading and doctored photos were widely shared during the protests, those
Money has been
responsible
put
relying
through.
on Americans being too ignorant to understand what they were looking at. For example, this photograph was being peddled as an anti-government protest. Except, uh-oh, that's not from 2021 at all. Nor is it even a protest. It's the 2018 May Day parade. Then there's this. Fox News deliberately lying to their viewers. Surprise, surprise.
So my family, like so many millions of other Cuban families, have seen the brutal oppression of communism firsthand. And I got to say, watching these images, watching Cuban people in the streets, risking their lives, when you stand up and protest.
Here's that same clip without the blur. We've seen pictures and videos of crowds where you can clearly see the July 26th flag. The flag supporting the Cuban Revolution and the current government. And those images are being used as evidence that the Cuban people are protesting against the government. Billions of dollars of US meddling over 60 years, and all they can scrape together is a tiny astroturfed protest. Meanwhile, the actual people of Cuba immediately understand what's going on and organize a massive counter-protest in a matter of hours. That's what real support looks like. Grassroots organizing and genuine care for their fellow Cubans and the protection of their revolution against imperialist aggression. But the physical protests were only one front in the war on Cuba.
Certified personal trainers are in high demand. Get started with this internationally renowned program and become recognized as a highly competent fitness professional.
I'm going to try
Our
to do
Easy
this
Learn
correctly.
system allows you to go through the certification process at your own pace and take the exam from home
Also, like-
when ready.
Sorry, no ads.
As soon as news of the protests broke, and I mean immediately, Twitter was flooded with brand new sock puppet accounts tweeting near identical messages. Any tweet that mentioned Cuba would immediately get responses from these fake accounts, all saying more or less the same thing. The Cuban people do not want an end to the blockade. The same blockade which is destroying the Cuban economy, destroying lives and livelihoods, and which has been universally denounced except by the United States and its apartheid state lapdog, Israel. Twitter also suppressed pro-government tweets, but allowed the anti-government bot army to freely violate their terms and conditions. If you take all of this into consideration, there is only one conclusion to be drawn. The protests in Cuba were an attempted color revolution by the United States, the country which has been hell-bent on either owning Cuba or destroying it for over 200 years. Now, I'm sure there are some Cubans who genuinely supported the anti-government protests. It would be foolish to assume that all the protesters were actors, plants, or otherwise compensated by the US. But it's important to understand that their genuine frustrations are all entirely the fault of the United States and our trillion-dollar blockade on their country. Even with the crippling sanctions, the Cuban government has done very well for their people and enjoys tremendous support. Imagine what they could do if the blockade were lifted. And that is exactly why it won't be. The US is alone in its demonization and inhumane treatment of Cuba. Even the New York Times, a staunchly capitalist outlet, allowed the printing of a full-page ad demanding an end to the 60-year blockade, signed by over 400 politicians, intellectuals, clergy, activists, and former heads of state. It should be clear by now why the most powerful country on Earth refuses to let another sovereign nation pursue its own development in its own way. The United States has always been, and always will be, terrified of the possibility of another economic system challenging the myth of capitalist superiority. If a socialist nation can prove itself anywhere in the world, and especially so close to home, the US will do its very best to destroy it and bend that nation to the will of global capitalism. If the President of the United States, the bastion of capitalism, has to go on TV twice in 1 week and defend capitalism as a viable economic system, you know they're getting worried. Socialism is trending upward, and American faith in capitalism is on the decline. It's no surprise we're seeing a massive surge in Cold War rhetoric and anti-communist propaganda on every news network and from every elected official. And it's why we'll continue to see more color revolutions like the one in Cuba going forward. Keep an eye on Latin America. That region will be the front lines in the fight against imperialism and capitalist domination. During the AstroTurf protests, the State Department Twitter account tweeted out a touching commemoration of Nelson Mandela, a man universally hailed as a great moral person. This, of course, is incredibly ironic considering the harsh words Mandela had for the US, and the fact that he admired and respected Fidel Castro, whom the United States demonizes to this day. For example, during apartheid, Mandela said of the US, "We are being advised about Cuba by people who supported the apartheid regime. No honorable man or woman could accept such advice." Biden has called Cuba a failed state and communism a failed system. Meanwhile, in the US, we're indoctrinated to see stories like this one as heartwarming. In Cuba, despite 60 years of backbreaking US sanctions, 7-year-olds don't have to sell lemonade to pay for their brain surgery, because healthcare is free. They have a much lower incarceration rate, a near-zero homelessness rate, and overwhelming support for their government. The United States is grasping at straws. Our sadistic imperialist regime is desperate not to let a left-wing government and economy just off our coast grow large and prosperous enough to offer Americans an alternative to the ever-worsening capitalist status quo. If US leadership really believes communism is a failed system, let it fail. Lift the blockade and watch it implode if you really believe it will. The United States does not care about the Cuban people. It has oppressed, exploited, occupied, and economically strangled another sovereign nation for entire generations. This will continue forever unless popular mass movements at home and abroad force US leadership to do the right thing. We have no right to sentence an entire country to a slow and painful death. When oppressed peoples around the world stand up and demand a better life, take note of the symbols they choose. It's certainly not the American flag. In every instance of oppressed populations standing against imperial aggressors, it's communist symbols they carry. And in every effort to crush those movements, the American flag leads the way. The Cuba protests represent a gut check moment for Western leftists. If you call yourself a socialist, but you spend all your time arguing with communists, demonizing socialist states as authoritarian, and performing apologetics for US imperialism, if your take on Cuba aligns with Joe Biden, Marco Rubio, and Ron DeSantis, I think some introspection is in order. Cuba must be free to forge its own path, determine its own future, and it must be freed from the shackles of US imperialism and capitalist oppression.
I know this isn't a female, but it's fine because you know what? I'm still gonna use it.
I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. When I decided to make the shift from general interest stuff to more radical political content, I knew I ran the risk of sinking my channel and losing my ad revenue and sponsors. These days, it's pretty hard to get a sponsor on my videos. I have one reliable one, and they're great. But for the most part, I'm having to rely on the generous support of viewers like you. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, as well as access to our patrons-only Discord server. It's a great place to hang out, chat with other like-minded people, or learn about socialist theory in our book club. I'm also pretty active in the server, so you're always welcome to ping me to ask a question or just say hi. You can find my Patreon, join our growing Discord server, and get early access to every video at patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous videos by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Here's the video.
Sometimes, when certain people are confronted with the consequences of capitalism, they try to spin it in a way that puts the responsibility of capitalism's crises and faults onto the notion of corporatism, or crony capitalism. This is a very flawed and frankly dishonest position to have, as I will illustrate. This sort of argument is primarily centered on two things. First of all, a continuum fallacy, and second of all, idealistic notions divorced from actual material conditions. Let's say that X is capitalism and Y is corporatism. There's no definable point where X, capitalism, becomes Y, corporatism. Therefore, there's no difference between X and Y. Basically, the argument fails to answer or even consider at what point does capitalism become corporatism. What percentage of government-granted monopolies and bailouts, subsidies, and corporate lobbying must exist to turn an economy from capitalist to corporatist? Is it 49%, 51, 35, 1%? What characteristics of capitalism fundamentally change during this transformation from capitalism to corporatism? How are they fundamentally different? On top of this, it is idealistic and divorced from material conditions because the concept of true capitalism requires a historically non-existent petty commodity production economy. It ignores the evolutionary nature of capitalism and the complex organization of economy. The argument basically makes the assumption that people within a market economy do not have an interest in mitigating risk and organizing to benefit from an economy of scale by pooling their resources and forming corporate vehicles for investment. It's against all historical and scientific evidence to claim that market competition does not entail the corollary that there will be a market winner who will do what is necessary to maintain their position, which includes lobbying the government, treatment, barriers against entry into the market from new competitors, etc. Even if you were to somehow bring capitalism more than a century back, when free competition did reign, you'd only be prolonging the inevitable. That is, the formation of monopolies, a natural trend of capitalist development, the use of the state to serve the interests of individual capitalists, groups of capitalists, or the capitalist class as a whole, etc. Whatever you do, these things will happen, and this is because these things are natural consequences of capitalism's development. Many large multinational corporations began as much smaller companies. The so-called free market is not some obstacle to monopoly, but rather a facilitator of monopolies. Every capitalist in any industry attempts to dominate the market. The very system demands they do so. There's no interest in playing fair in order to not crush the competition. It's really weird how the proponents of the free market preach the virtues of free market competition based on what they claim to be the fact that humans are self-seeking entities, yet at the same time they seem to expect stockholders and directors of major corporations to go against their economic self-interests in order to maintain a state of fair competition with their rivals. Yet even crazier, proponents of the free market think that somehow capitalists should refuse to use their massive wealth and resources to obtain favorable treatment and other benefits from the state, thus sacrificing a crucial advantage over their competitors. This, well, idiocy exposes itself, really. Let's come back to reality now. Anyone can do some research into the largest multinational corporations and find out how they started. Many have very humble roots. Capitalism is a mode of production, and like previous modes of production, it evolves over time. It does not disappear one day just because the state passes new regulations or removes old ones. It does not change into some kind of wrong capitalism just because lobbyists bounce favors with politicians. Were that the case, we could say that capitalism never existed at all. The problem isn't crony capitalism or cowboy capitalism, monopoly capitalism, hyper-capitalism, or whatever other prefix people will come up with next week. These conservatives and right-wing libertarians drastically underestimate the extent to which state intervention has been structurally central to capitalism as a historical system since its very beginnings. For example, the enclosure of open fields for sheep pasture in late medieval and early modern times, the parliamentary enclosures of common woods, waste and pasture in the 18th century, the colonial enclosure of land in the Third World and eviction of native cultivators, the engrossment of Third World mines and mineral resources, the enslavement of foreign and domestic populations. Nothing remotely resembling the modern concentration of economic power and wealth, or the model of corporate capitalism most people think of as normal nowadays, would ever have been possible without all these forms of state intervention. You can pair capitalism with any prefix, adjective, or noun as you see fit, but the internal contradictions, exploitation, instability, and absurdities don't lie in the words. They are all inherent features of capitalism, plain and simple. Any proposed solution to the inherent problems of capitalism, which essentially boil down to more capitalism, are eventually doomed to failure. I'll leave you with this last note. If these people who claim corporatism are honest and truthful, then let them answer this. Are all the great things we have nowadays given to us by capitalism then, or corporatism? Thanks for watching, and thank you so much for 2,000 subs. I apologize for being away for a while. Sadly, there will be more of that for the time being. No worries though, I'll still try my hardest to...
All right, what next? What should we do next? There we go. There we go. Let's debunk some shit.
Hi there. Today I thought I'd do another debunking video as we haven't done one in a while. If you're like me, frequently cursed by the YouTube recommendation algorithm, then you probably came across this video that's been recommended quite a bit. 5 Socialist Myths by a channel called John Stossel. Intrigued, I clicked it, and boy do I regret it. So what is John Stossel, or who is John Stossel? The Americans among you might already know, but I had no idea. Honestly, looking at this dude, I was confused. He looks like the sort of guy that sells off-brand soda here in Iraq, but apparently he's an American newscaster that used to work for Fox News. A noted libertarian, he's shared bits of wisdom like, the free market is voluntary, everyone gets to choose his own path. That's
5
justice.
minutes.
Injustice is forcing people to do what their rulers decide is fair. Yeah.
I
Having
think I
the
can get
market
back.
decide that you're in too low of an income bracket to provide decent housing or healthcare for
100%.
justice.
Drop that off, kill some things
He's
around
also
it.
noted for stating, and I quote, It should be the right of private businesses to
There's gonna be a ferry or so
very upset
under
citizens.
Carno.
He's also known for running a multi-year show titled Stossel, in which he entertained guests and supported their positions on climate change denial, privatizing healthcare, fawning over the glorified toilet paper that is Atlas Shrugged, reducing taxes on the rich, opposition to a minimum wage, less regulation, the usual libertarian nonsense. Surprisingly, or better yet, disappointingly, he's quite popular in the US. What's even more surprising to me, though, is that he also heads something called Stossel in the Classroom, a program which basically exposes millions of American elementary and high school students to his climate change denial and other such propaganda in schools.
Bro, that's
A
not
few
fucking
Americans
cool.
have even told me that they were shown his videos in university. So, you may not be surprised to find out that his two foundations, the Reason Foundation and
I
the
just
Center for Independent
moved this
Thought,
up. I'm
funnily
sorry
enough,
if you guys
are
couldn't hear
funded
that.
by the fossil fuel industry. The Cato Institute, which also funds PragerU, also happens to throw some money towards this guy. For all this money, though, he's been lauded for being a less than honest journalist, to say the least. I can't imagine why. Basically, your usual capitalist shill that lies through his teeth for a paycheck from industries hell-bent on destroying the earth for profits. How lovely. Now, what could such a respectable individual have to say about socialism? Let's take a look.
People eagerly find fault with capitalism.
If capitalism works, if this is the best we got, why does it seem to give such a raw deal?
A raw deal? Is that what we get?
Oh god, I don't want anything raw from you, Habibi, please. I'm trying to keep this video monetized.
I hear that from people now working for Joe Biden.
Do I look like a radical socialist?
No, you look like an establishment Democrat that's itching to get another war going, like all your predecessors.
Not especially, but with so many upset about America's wealth disparities. It's time to take a closer look at the socialism these people want.
This is class war!
We are committed to transforming our society into one based on freedom, equality, and solidarity.
The belief that socialism will bring that is why it's now as popular as capitalism among young people.
Oh, wow.
One, it already did bring that historically, but secondly, I really don't like the wording of this poll. What they mean by socialism is social democracy, usually, which is infinitely disappointing. Also, capitalism being popular with young adults just means that there's a whole lot of people that don't know their class interests. It's surprising the number isn't higher, though, since capitalism is basically America's civil religion at this point.
Another big reason is, oddly, this 90-year-old, linguist Noam Chomsky. Student studies working class, and colleges pay him up to $30,000 to speak.
Thanks very much.
Yet for generations, Chomsky misled students by calling capitalism a grotesque catastrophe.
Chomsky has done his share of good, but also has been somewhat detrimental to socialism with his incredibly skewed perspectives on historically existing socialism. If you want to learn a bit about the faults of former socialism as well as the Chomsky type of ineffectual criticism, you can check out these two videos of mine here. Otherwise, check out Chomsky's greatest works, Manufacturing Consent, or the book it may have been inspired from, Michael Parenti's Inventing Realities, which is a superior book on the topic.
1.5
I thought the fall of Soviet communism would put an end to such nonsense. Surely everyone would now see the catastrophe is socialism. But no, socialism has come back strong.
I thought the fall of Republican Spain, or Weimar Republic, or Allende's Chile would put an end to democracy. I thought the fall of the numerous Portuguese republics or the dozens of other failed capitalist states would put an end to capitalism. You see how stupid this sounds? Regardless, the USSR and Soviet socialism didn't fall. It was illegally and undemocratically dissolved against the will of the Soviet people. I've done a video on this here. Also, fighting socialism globally with every means at their disposal, from rigging elections all throughout the world against communist parties, or setting up secret anti-communist NATO armies, or diplomatically and financially supporting anti-communist fascist militias across Latin America, or overthrowing democratically elected socialists and putting fascists in power in their place, or massacring hundreds of thousands of suspected communists in order to quell the popularity of socialism by terror, or the other countless horrific ways the US and their NATO allies have helped murder, destroy, or otherwise impede a widely and massively popular social and political movement in every corner of the earth can, unsurprisingly, cause it to take a few attempts to perfect. And even the few attempts that existed succeeded magnificently given their conditions. The real catastrophe is capitalism, an untenable and flawed system that, if we do not abolish, will end up abolishing us as a species.
So in this video and the next, we'll bust 5 myths about socialism. The first is the claim that wasn't real socialism.
Finally, we get to the myths. Now, I don't know a single Marxist, and I've been part of the left for quite a while now, that claimed that the USSR, the PRC, or Cuba, or the GDR, Vietnam, or the many other examples were not real socialism. This is more of an anarchist or social democrat talking. Very roughly, for Marxists, socialism is, and I quote a previous video, political power and the state is in the hands of the working class, through vanguard parties, working class organizations, or otherwise. There is the nationalization of industry and collectivization of agriculture. There is the institution of a national economic plan for the development of the economy and society. There is a reorganization of workplaces from the top-down capitalist enterprise model to either state-owned or collective organization based on differing levels of self-management. There is suppression of markets, or elimination if possible, and the elimination of wage labor. There is necessary social reorganization in the form of a cultural revolution which seeks to support the creative and emancipatory political will of the people, as well as weed out reactionary ideas like racism, sexism, etc. through re-education and discussion, among several other things. If it had these things in a rough outline, it is socialism. Now, why do certain other sectors of the left use the "it's not real socialism" talking point? Simple. They want to distance themselves from what is widely assumed and usually incorrect about formerly existing socialisms. I can refer you to my 2 previous videos on leftist criticism of former socialism, as well as the trend of left-wing anti-communism that takes the form of incorrect, misplaced, or outright wrong criticism of former socialism. Check them out for more information.
The Soviet Union, this was about as remote from socialism as you can imagine.
It's absurd to say that the Soviet Union was remote from socialism.
Economist Ben Powell reminds us that when the Soviets made private business illegal,
that's about as close as the world ever saw to the pure socialist end of the spectrum.
The anti-communist side isn't much better, as you can see. Yes, elimination of private property is a very, very important factor, but isn't absolutely everything.
But whenever socialism fails, people always say, that wasn't real socialism.
First of all, I love the choice of images, really putting the ideology to work there. You know, I could do the same. Show footage of people on a boat somewhere with no context, a few lines, empty store shelves, and a ridiculously handsome man giving a speech, to show how much capitalism sucks. This is done intentionally to reinforce certain biases the school system and the media and popular culture try to drill into you. It's surprising that they didn't use a picture of satellites and Sputniks, which are socialist projects that brought humanity to the cosmos, and footage of children eating, as socialist countries across the board had higher caloric intake and actually met the nutritional requirements of their populations, unlike their capitalist counterparts, and footage of women scientists, as socialist countries place a much higher emphasis on educating women and liberating them than capitalism ever did. And in fact, said socialist policies in the USSR were the reason the US even considered expanding education for women, or the socialist international solidarity between nations, like Cuba's support for Vietnam during the horrific American aggression against her people. Regardless, our boy Stossel talks about the failures of socialism, but to quote said ridiculously handsome man I mentioned earlier, where is the success of capitalism in Africa, Asia, and Latin America? Stossel repeats the usual mistake of these propagandist types. He compares countries with incredibly poor starting points prior to socialism to nations that were already incredibly wealthy, for example comparing the USSR to the US. When a much more fair comparison would be to compare the USSR to India, or Brazil, or the North African and West Asian regions, all which had much closer starting points to the USSR than the US did. But no, they don't do that because they're intentionally dishonest and don't want to give you the truth. Instead, they want to sell you a lie of a system built on the exploitation of the third world, our environment, immigrant populations, and you.
Socialism means abolishing private property in the major things that go into production and replacing it with some form of collective ownership. In practice, this means state ownership and control, and the Soviet Union had an abundance of that.
Of course, the Soviet Union is now gone, so some say
there is no true socialist country that exists today.
But there is. Look at Venezuela.
Just eating is a luxury.
When I say socialism created hardship there, people trash me on my own social media. Read a book. Venezuela's not socialist. Think a bit.
Oh lord, there it is. Vuvuzela. These people are 100% right. Please just think for once in your life. I already dealt with this argument a few times before, so here's a quick rundown. Before that, though, I love the propagandistic food is a luxury bit. The reason Venezuela is having trouble now is because of American pressure, economic warfare, and a highly under-diversified economy dependent on oil prices, all things the US had a direct hand in. You can't show something without the context. If I shot you in the leg and then you had trouble walking, that's because I shot you in the leg, not because of personal failure on your part. Take a look at the list I mentioned earlier, the abolishing of private property, collectivization, nationalization, reorganization, production, etc., and see if any of that applies to Venezuela. The economist Stossel brought disproves this himself when he said socialism is when private property is replaced with some sort of collective ownership. Very little of that is present in Venezuela. In
What's up,
Venezuela,
Tom?
2/3 of the economy is in private hands. Half of the healthcare is private. 80% of the workforce is employed in the private sector. If this is socialism and we applied the same characteristics to other countries, does that make them socialist too? If that's the case, why doesn't he consider Norway socialist as well? Sweden and France, they are all more socialist by those very same criteria. France, Norway, Sweden, and other European countries have larger public sectors and public programs, sometimes by a much larger margin. This is all socialism, right? No. In reality, neither those countries nor Venezuela are socialist. This isn't a not true socialism argument. This is a they definitely aren't socialist argument. Cuba, the USSR, the GDR, etc. These countries can legitimately be considered to be socialist, but not Norway, France, or Venezuela. Please just learn the definitions, I beg of you.
I'll do better than that. I'll listen to the politician who wrecked Venezuela.
Oh God, for the love of God, please. Go ask poor Venezuelans if Chavez wrecked Venezuela. They're the ones who resisted your government's coup attempts time and time again, after all.
El capitalismo es el reino de la injusticia.
Because capitalism is tyranny. Hugo Chavez said his government must take over businesses.
¿Y este edificio? Es un edificio que tiene comercio privado de joyería. Expropiese. Expropiese.
That's socialism.
Another out-of-context clip that doesn't count as evidence. These are numbers we can check, please. The private sector is still the dominant sector within the economy. Just because Venezuelan oil was nationalized doesn't make it
That
socialist.
should be it. That should be it.
Countless
All
European
I
nations
needed.
have
Right there.
nationalized industries to some
68,
extent. Does that make
hopefully.
them socialist? Again, the answer is no.
The socialists turned the richest country in Latin America, the nation with the biggest oil reserves in the world,
Let me grab
into
another
the poorest
coffee.
You could see this would be hard-hitting if you didn't build this all on previous lies. But no, you doubled down and lied some more. Stossel mentioned it being a prosperous country. For the rich, maybe. Conveniently, the 45% poverty rate that existed at the time, and the one that Chavez drastically lowered, is not mentioned. Why not mention why Venezuela is facing difficulties now? Venezuela faced coup after coup attempt, directly supported by the US government, which not only sent tens of millions of dollars to the opposition, but...
Alright, what's going on, boys and girls? Oh shit, this is an ad. We don't like ads over here. Sorry.
But even as recently as last year attempted to send in special forces secretly with the task of arresting or assassinating government officials and community organizers. Thankfully, the plan failed, but this is not even mentioning the economic warfare and sanctions by the US, as well as indigenous difficulties within Venezuela. For example, receiving an economy built on nothing but oil revenue from that very same neoliberal era he hailed a second ago. When oil prices were high, high social spending followed. When oil crashed, so did the spending. It happened during the neoliberal era of Venezuela, and it happened again now. Later on in the video, they claim that other oil-dependent countries didn't do as bad as Venezuela. Yet that's just blatantly not true. My country, Iraq, was also a sanctioned third-world oil-dependent country that saw its living standards plummet as a result of American aggression. They're just straight up lying. This isn't an issue of socialism. This is an issue of a sanctioned and underdeveloped economy that has been thoroughly imperialized and used to subsidize the growth of the largest economy and military power in history at the expense of the regular Venezuelan people. When those very same Venezuelan people finally decide to take their destiny into their own hands, the US turns around and sanctions them, coups them, assassinates or attempts to assassinate their leaders, carries out economic warfare, and does whatever is in its power to force its economy to its knees. When that happens, the US turns around and says, look at how horrible their situation is. It's all the fault of insert progressive force that has actually managed to improve the situation for the poor in that country. Be it Venezuela or Cuba or the DPRK, the story is always the same. Not to sound like a broken record, but if I shot you in the leg, you know the rest. Alright, now I'll skip across myth 2 because he keeps going on about how Venezuela is socialist when it simply isn't. But I'll highlight one thing here.
In our capitalist society, when COVID hit,
what did we start seeing? Millions of entrepreneurs adjusting without government orders of how to deliver their products and services.
Servers have switched roles to delivery drivers while bartenders have turned into sales reps.
Restaurants installed the heat lamps, expanded patios, did delivery.
All the reporters complained about the absence of federal direction. No central authority could possibly direct all these individual adjustments in thousands of different places.
Are you serious? Honestly. Americans watching this, please tell me, did the magical market solve all your issues and make it so that nothing is wrong in the US now? Have we completely forgotten the millions upon millions of unemployed? What about the rent crisis? The 500,000 dead, for Christ's sake. No guys, don't worry, your grandparents dying was all according to the all-knowing invisible hands plan. Jesus Christ, how out of touch can somebody be? Also, yes, a government can coordinate all of this effectively. China, Vietnam, New Zealand, and many more did so and were blindingly successful. How can he say this as his fellow Americans go homeless or die? I genuinely don't understand. The rest of the video just complains that a car designed and produced in East Germany in the early 60s produced pollution. Yeah, no shit. So did every other car of the era. Then they compare said affordably produced family car in a nation with an expensive public transportation system that rendered car ownership practically pointless to a Porsche, a literal luxury car, complaining that said Porsche is more enjoyable to drive. Yeah, that's the level of honesty we're dealing with here. Stossel goes on with his delusions, painting economic planning as one mind having to be all-knowing, which is a hilarious caricature and very, very wrong as you may expect. Firstly, markets allocate according to profit, not need. They're a notoriously ineffective and unjust system of planning anything other than maximizing profits. Planning worked, and worked surprisingly well when it was done by hand. Now, though, all the former criticisms have fallen apart because nowadays we have modern computing. In your pocket as we speak, you have a modern smartphone that can comfortably plan very complicated multi-year schemes, and modern supercomputers can plan economies as complex as the US's. If you'd like further reading on modern planning, take a look at Snapshots Towards a New Socialism. Yes, I'll keep recommending this until all of you read it. If you're interested in reading more about East Germany, though, take a look at the book Stasi State or Socialist Paradise by Bruno de la Motte. They finally top it all off with claiming that US sanctions that have been on Cuba for over half a century aren't all that bad, and honestly, it's so fucking disgusting. Only the US can cripple a nation, support terrorism within said nation, and blame CIA-sponsored terrorism in the US on an innocent foreign government, by the way, attempt countless coup attempts on its government, and hundreds of assassination attempts on its leaders, and then turn around and be like, you guys complain too much, it isn't that bad. I really hope for Stossel and his buddy here that there won't be a day of reckoning when they'll be placed on sanctions so that they taste what their government has done to countless nations across the earth. Jesus, we're only 2 minutes in. Oh god, okay, let's get through the rest of it a little quicker.
In my last video, we covered 2 big myths about socialism, but we have more. So here's myth 3. Socialism brings good things if it's democratic socialism.
Socialism, just across the board, brings good things. You'd know that if you escaped your little bubble and did some reading. Regardless, this is another one of those memes that kind of just exists in the US and nowhere else. Democratic socialism implies other socialisms weren't, which is an incredibly ignorant position to take. Unlike under capitalism, where all power is situated with those that have the most money, under socialism, numerous streams of determining all aspects of life, from a constitution, to economic planning, to laws, and everything in between, are determined by people democratically voting, either directly or through delegates, to councils, congresses, and committees. Historic examples of socialism practice this, with certain limitations as a result of their conditions, of course, and currently existing socialism continues to do so, from Vietnam to Cuba. If you're interested in learning about this, then check out my book recommendations video on how the USSR worked exactly here. Otherwise, this video by Endymion is excellent, and so is this very interesting article by the Japanese Political Science Review titled Rethinking Soviet Democracy, Popular Participation in Family Law Reform.
Alright, let's get back to base.
The examples of failed socialism that critics use are not socialist democracies, but authoritarian states.
Democratic socialists denounce all that. The key word for them, democratic. They believe that both the government and the economy should be run by the people by way of the ballot box.
Esta es la hora del pueblo bolivariano.
But Venezuela's socialist was elected.
Aquí no hay dictadura. Yo he sido electo aquí 3 veces.
They can start off democratically elected, and then once they centralize control over the economy, it becomes impossible to democratically unelect them.
Economist Ben Powell.
Now, Maduro rules while ordering state employees to vote for him or they lose their job.
Maduro blatantly buying votes.
They put food aid stations next to polling places and you get rewarded with rations if you vote correctly. Now democracy there is a sham.
The claims of voter manipulation in Venezuela and Bolivia, etc., and all that have been debunked time and time again, so all of this is outright nonsense. The food rations if you vote correctly thing is in fact not a feature of socialism, but a feature of capitalism. You've never seen third world voting in so-called capitalist democracies if you haven't seen people handing out sandwiches and school supplies for voting the right way, meaning for neoliberal candidates. Ask a Latin American friend of that and listen.
Your friends are helping you renovate. You know you owe them dinner, right?
Delicious Schwann's home deliveries in the freezer.
That's...
Listen, baby.
It always becomes authoritarian? Always?
Everywhere you try socialism, that's what you get.
Why?
It's hard to exercise political freedom if you don't have economic freedoms. If you're dependent upon the state for your livelihood, you lose your ability to use your voice to oppose them because you can be punished.
This is something that I want to touch on. Now, of course, literally everything they said was outright nonsense. There is no economic freedom under capitalism. Americans barely have enough money to survive $500 emergencies or a trip to the ER, let alone the thousands of dollars necessary to start and maintain a business. But that's not the point I want to touch on. What I want to touch on is this. Why is it that socialist governments that are besieged, constantly sabotaged, diplomatically isolated, economically sanctioned, targeted by CIA assassination plots and coup attempts, demonized in Western media to no end despite their successes in the face of all their adversities, why could they possibly need to employ authoritarian methods? I can't seem to find an answer myself. In all seriousness, that doesn't mean those governments were perfect. They did things wrong and deserve to be rightly criticized, as long as that criticism is nuanced, educated, and in good faith. A good book to give a chance on this is Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, which I highly recommend. Otherwise, a great food for thought piece is Human Rights in the USSR by Albert Szymanski, which compares with the US. Give it a go.
But unfortunately, people don't realize that when they're promoting democratic socialism.
Democratic socialism is your kid's public school.
It's the researchers and scientists paid with our taxes.
It's our interstate highway system.
We're not purely capitalist. There are some industries that are government-owned, operated, and controlled, socialized, if you will. It's no accident that when you look at these and think about things that are inefficiently done and underperforming, our public education, our congested streets, these socialized industries don't work well.
One thing he got right is that, yes, these things don't mean socialism. Socialism is about the relations to the means of production, not just free healthcare and education, although those are highly important aspects of the policy of socialist nations. One thing he got very wrong, though, is the meme that because they're socialized, as he says, that they underperform and should be privatized. He, of course, omits the context, as expected. These things underperform because they've been gutted and defunded to shit, baby. Had they had a proper budget, they'd run just fine. In fact, they'd run really well, like they do in pretty much the rest of the world. Private ownership means efficiency. This is a meme. It doesn't exist. And anyone that's had a privately owned electricity or utility provider can attest to that. Privatization turns things from working for need to things working for profit. Not exactly a smart way of running our most essential aspects of society. Ha-Chun Chang's 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism is a good read for further information.
But what about
Norway? It's as socialist as they come.
Instead of Cuba or China, think Sweden.
Myth 4. Socialism does work well in Scandinavia.
Alright, I'll skip myth 4 because he magically learns what socialism is all of a sudden and correctly states that the Scandinavian countries are not socialist. This flexibility of thought isn't applied when thinking about Venezuela, though.
Finally, myth 5. Socialism is completely different from fascism.
Oh lord, let me guess. Red flags? Is that the level of discourse here? Are you just gonna compare people marching next to each other or some shit?
When a congressman said,
the potential is out there for another Hitler, socialist like Hitler, to come along.
Another congressman said he was wrong.
It's the Nazis that's terrible, not the socialists. They were Nazis who killed Jews, and I get offended when you compare socialists to Nazis.
They were fascists.
It's true that fascism and socialism aren't exactly the same, but they do have a lot in common.
Oh boy, call me surprised. They thought they're clever when they put military parades next to each other. Hey look, I can do that too.
Yikes.
The UK is fascist, the US is fascist, France is Huh, I may be onto something. Joking aside, anyone can play this silly Pictionary game. Look, here. These posters are all the same, so that means that the incredibly complex social, political, and economic intricacies all mean nothing, right?
They both replace market decision-making with command and control.
Outright lie. All fascist governments had markets and only started loose state planning of still private enterprises only when the war reached its worst points, just like all capitalist countries do. Hell, the concept of privatization was coined by Nazi Germany. Hitler wasn't a socialist, and neither was the German economy at the time socialist. Academics have proven this time and time again. Democratic Socialist 01 has a great video on it too, for those interested.
As an average person living your life, whether under socialism or fascism, you lose your autonomy, your control over your own future. Only under capitalism do you have the freedom to say no.
Alright, let me ask you Americans. Do you feel like you have control over your own future?
Nope.
When education is at monopoly prices, you have to take Ubers over taxis in fear of being bankrupted if you need a ride to a hospital.
Okay.
Let alone
Let's see.
Your rent climbs to 40, 50, or even 80% of your monthly salary. You have no employment guarantee, and bosses can do whatever they like with you. Is this the freedom this guy is talking about?
Entrepreneurs offer you their services. They offer you employment. You can say no and choose a better path for yourself.
The only freedom you have under capitalism is to say no to life-saving treatment because you know you'll be bankrupt and have to spend the rest of your life either in prison or wage slaving to pay it off. The only freedom you have under capitalism is to be forced to join the military and kill other workers that haven't done anything to you abroad because your family has no way of paying for your education. The only freedom you have under capitalism is to be forced to work 2 jobs to make ends meet, while the richest in the country have practically doubled their wealth during this pandemic. Please, I hope you see this bullshit propaganda for what it is. There's a reason Stossel and his buddy here don't speak in facts, but in platitudes. They know they're full of shit. They're just lying for a paycheck.
We went to Socialism 2018, the biggest gathering of young socialists, and they pointed out lots of problems in the United States. Problems with migration, with war, with policing. The problems they were identifying were the product of bad government that the U.S. is giving them, not capitalism.
If this myopic nonsense isn't enough to show you that these people have no idea what they're talking about, well then I don't know what to tell you.
In the last 20 years, we've seen more humans escape extreme poverty than any other time in human history.
I wonder where the absolute majority of that poverty reduction happened. Could it possibly be the People's Republic of China? Fuck, at least stay consistent with your propaganda. When it comes to poverty alleviation, taking China out leaves a much less impressive picture. And that's that. Sorry, but I had to subject myself to this, so you had to be subjected too. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you too.
So, see what's going on here.
Oh no! You
see what David Peckman's wrong about. Yeah, he's. I can agree. He's liberal propaganda.
Hello, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all. Today I thought I'd make a fun little reaction video, and one video kind of stood out to me. Why I'm Not a Socialist by David Peckman. Fine, not a Mimi, PragerU.
I want mommy, I want milk, I want to be held, I want to be comforted.
Video, but educational nonetheless. I'm unfamiliar with him, but this seems like the fabled social democratic theory spoken of only in legends, so let's take a look and have some fun. Slight preface, no hate towards this guy. I've just been sent this video a lot, so why not, I thought. Otherwise, like I said, I'm not really familiar with his political positions, let's say. Anyway, so he starts off by defining that he's a social democrat and is for a socially guided market economy. Nothing too weird here. Let's see what else he has to say.
What's your position, David? And I've mentioned before that I'm not a socialist. I'm a social democrat in the sort of Nordic or Swedish tradition. And today I'm going to explain to you why I am not a socialist. And I'm happy to do this. It's something that's been an area of study for me since undergraduate and even including in graduate school.
This is something that stood out to me immediately. How have you been studying this for around half a decade and still not evolved past the most basic social democrat talking points? He seems to show an incomplete understanding as to why social democracies currently exist, and even further ignorance as to what currently sustains them.
Fundamentally, I'm not a socialist because I want an egalitarian, free, self-determining society, and that type of society will not emerge from authoritarian apparatus.
An egalitarian, free, self-determining society. Capitalism doesn't provide that, Habibi. Historically, it was the threat of socialist revolution that pushed egalitarian principles and political agendas to the forefront. The nonsense authority point is as wrong as it is boring at this point. Capitalism is an inherently authoritarian system. Getting kicked out of your job and being forced to be homeless on the street because you missed a rent payment or had a medical bill you couldn't pay apparently isn't authoritarian. Regardless, he probably would rebut, but social democracies have protective nets against these sort of things. Well, that's true in part, but where do you think the wealth for all that came from? Don't you think authoritarian means were used to secure the resources that allow for those safety nets? Firstly, many beacons of social democracy, like Britain and France, were massive imperial powers that built their wealth on the destruction of indigenous industry, colonial taxes, and the direct theft of the areas and peoples they've subjugated. Secondly, even those countries, like Norway, that didn't have direct empire still exploit the imperial periphery via unequal exchange and value transference. Companies in social democratic countries still take advantage of cheap immigrant labor at home and cheap imperial periphery labor abroad. They still rely on market preference via IMF restructuring of third world economies that puts the core in advantage over the periphery. This is something made beautifully clear in the works of Zach Cope, John Smith, Intense Wandi, and others, which I cannot recommend enough. Regardless, social democracy basically advocates for, rather than stripping the bourgeoisie of their unearned privilege and stolen wealth, we instead grovel at their feet for small concessions that they'll regally laud over you as some great self-sacrificing favor, despite the fact that workers, much like yourself, were the originators of all that wealth that's providing for those concessions in the first place.
And what that means is that at the national level, socialist and communist structures are fundamentally authoritarian, and at scale, enacting socialism or communism becomes authoritarian.
Repeating the same point, basically. It's a tired centrism. When the capitalist class does whatever it has to do in order to secure its wealth, power, and privilege, that's just how life is. But when a working class government does the same, it's all of a sudden authoritarian. Rules for thee, not for me, yada yada. If you're interested in a deeper dive into this, I made a video concerning authoritarianism you can check out here. Just know, authoritarianism is a two-way street. Socialists are just honest enough to admit that political aims may require authoritarian means, whatever those may be. Those that support capitalism also understand this, they just cover it up with sophistry and ideology in a limp attempt at seeming more respectable and reasonable, despite presiding over a system that has historically, as well as in the modern day, been far more barbaric than anything that's preceded it. Behind every nice-seeming social democrat is a neoliberal, or even worse, a fascist, why am I saying the same thing 3 times, that will bomb, murder, interfere, sabotage, and destroy in order to secure higher profits against the backdrop of token outrage from the oh-so-reasonable social democrats. Vietnam, Iraq, Grenada, history is my witness. Take a look at the works, late Victorian Holocausts, The Triumph of Evil, Killing Hope, or honestly any book on modern imperialism to see for yourself. Or hell, even Michael Parenti's Against Empire. Very highly recommended.
And a top example is Venezuela.
And here's why you shouldn't listen to what this guy has to say by and large. Habibi, Venezuela is a social democratic country. They have made no serious attempts at surpassing capitalism, challenging the market, or even destroying the power of the capitalist class. There is no central plan. The working class doesn't hold sole political power. Private property hasn't been abolished. There is still wage labor. I can go on. I don't know how many times this needs to be said, but socialism isn't when the government does stuff. Nor is it when a party has a socialist in the name. At the beginning of the video, he seems to understand this distinction, but when it comes to actual material realities, he's completely off the mark. Pac-Man's contention seems to boil down to not why I'm not a socialist, but more to why I prefer the social democracies of white European countries, completely devoid of any serious analysis. The reason Venezuela has been more quote-unquote authoritarian, a claim that needs to be heavily substantiated, mind you, is because it's under constant economic, diplomatic, and even at times military warfare by the largest superpower to ever exist, the United States. Unlike the Denmarks and Frances of the world that are allowed to develop more or less on their own, Venezuela is being pressured beyond belief, and as a result, they've had to combat, amongst other things, actual American coup attempts, assassination attempts, and CIA-sponsored riots in an artificial attempt to dislodge the current democratically elected leadership. This isn't even mentioning the economic aspect. He hand-waves this away as if it isn't a legitimate reason. If tomorrow Denmark was under the same pressure and took similar actions, guess who'd be there defending their actions? Not to play the racism card, but it really does kind of feel like that Peter Griffin meme. The whiter they are, the more okay it is.
Let's assume in good faith that the Chavez-Maduro goal was a truly egalitarian, free, thriving society. I don't know if it was, but let's be charitable, right? And they really did want that as the end goal. When you put aside the populist, collectivist rhetoric of that regime, the Venezuelan regime is an authoritarian imposition of government without all sorts of freedoms, lacking in press freedom, lacking in judicial freedom. It's a long list, and I'm opposed to it.
Oh boy, and capitalist countries abound on that, do they? Firstly, press and judicial freedom needs to be defined, and most of the time are nothing more than memes. Lenin has some fun words on this, so let's take a listen. For the bourgeoisie, freedom of the press means freedom for the rich to publish and for the capitalists to control the newspapers, a practice which in all countries, including even the freest, produced a corrupt press.
I am literally
all
garbage.
over the world, wherever there are capitalists, freedom of the press means freedom to buy up newspapers, to buy writers, to bribe, buy and fake public opinion for the benefit of the bourgeoisie. As ever, Lenin's words are prophetic, and a complete mirror of even modern times. I recommend you read the full publications, they're very short. Nonetheless, moving on.
And whatever their intentions were, their imposition of those intentions in this authoritarian way has led to absolute disaster. And some socialists, Leninists, will say that the opposition to the Venezuelan regime is American AstroTurf, or that the replacement to Maduro might be worse. Step back for a second. An authoritarian apparatus will not lead to an egalitarian, self-determining society, period.
This is an argument that needs to be substantiated, again. By our own strange definitions, Cuba is authoritarian, but has indeed resulted in an egalitarian, self-determining society. In contrast, many of the social democracies of Europe have highly rising inequality, and their ability to self-determine their politics is laughable, to say the least. Politics in social democracies are like every other capitalist country. The rich will try as hard as they can, and 99 out of 100 times will succeed in getting their demands met. This is not an anomaly of the system, it's a feature. Is this willful ignorance on his part? I'm genuinely unsure.
But for today, we're talking about modern socialist theory, and that dates back roughly to about the 1800s. And there are three main lines of socialist theory.
Oh, has he read Engels? I'm assuming not. Let's hopefully be pleasantly surprised.
Almost no one who likes to talk about socialism on the internet actually knows about this stuff. This is really important. This is the nuts and bolts.
I'm sorry, what? Firstly, this is literally 101 stuff. Don't impose your own company's lack of knowledge on these subjects on everyone else. But secondly, I'm fairly confident you'll get your classifications at least a little confused, so... I don't even know why I try, honestly. TLDR of these few upcoming minutes, utopians, anarchists, and Marxist-Leninists are the three trends of socialism according to him, which is strange, I guess. He's mixing up three different time frames, and I personally wouldn't break it up this way, but for a quick rundown, I guess it's alright. He seems to be open to utopian ideas applying to modern nations, which is unsurprising. Bonus points to him, though, because he realizes that the most dominant and common trend of socialism in the current era is Marxism-Leninism, which is an established fact. Democratic socialists, DeLeonists, Tradcath fanboys, and pretty much every other niche trend barely exist in the imperial core, and practically don't exist in the imperial periphery, or exist as infinitely small groupings, mostly on the internet. That's not meant as offense to anyone who identifies as such, but when dealing with material realities, we have to look at the facts. Nonetheless, then he goes on to explain the labor theory of value decently enough, and says he likes it. But then he says this.
The problem is I don't believe the ultimate solution to that identification is the end stage of capitalism with a Marxist revolution. That's not what I see as the long-term solution.
So ending the capitalist system isn't the solution. Instead, let's stay in a system predicated on infinite growth on a finite planet, but with more free healthcare and gay prison guards. I swear liberals really are something else.
What previously had been sort of a cohesive movement, but with different approaches, utopianism, anarchism, Marxism, Leninism.
Our movement has never been cohesive, but whatever. Have you read Marx's letters?
And this gets to one of my fundamental oppositions to socialism's view of the distributions of outcomes versus social democracies. Socialism in the Marxist-Leninist sort of tradition is simply not aligned with the realities of human distribution.
Oh boy, is this really a human nature argument? I thought you said you studied this for years, man. What is this?
Because when we look at human endeavors, they have unequal distribution. If you look at athletic ability and how it's distributed, if you look at linguistic proficiency, if you look at business success, if you look at human height, human weight, it's all distributed on a curve. And on the one hand, where socialism wants to level out the distribution in a way that I've not seen evidence can actually be achieved without significant downsides, what social democracy wants to do is tweak that distribution, lower the absolute top, raise the bottom a little bit, and then reduce the gap between the very bottom and the very top. You're sort of leveling it out. You're raising the mean and reducing the difference between top and bottom.
Oh, alright, disappointed but not surprised. Let's quote some Lenin, shall we? I've quoted his publication titled A Liberal Professor on Equality many times, but it seems it still isn't enough. The quote is long, but Lenin's hilarious, so bear with it, timestamp, blah blah. This is the reasoning of a liberal scholar who repeats the incredibly trite and threadbare argument that experience and reason clearly prove that men are not equal, yet socialism bases its ideal on equality. Hence, socialism, if you please, is an absurdity which is contrary to experience and reason and so forth. Mr. Two-Gun, maybe Mr. Pac-Man in this case, repeats the old trick of the reactionaries, first to misinterpret socialism by making it out to be an absurdity, and then to triumphantly refute that absurdity. When we say that experience and reason proves that men are not equal, we mean by equality, equality in abilities, or similarity in physical strength and mental ability. It goes without saying that in this respect, men are not equal. No sensible person and no socialist forgets this, but this kind of equality has nothing whatsoever to do with socialism. If Mr. Tugin is unable to think, he is at least able to read the well-known works of one of the founders of scientific socialism, Frederick Engels. Directed against Dühring, he would find there a special section explaining the absurdity of imagining that economic equality means anything else than the abolition of classes. But when professors set out to refute socialism, one never knows what to wonder at most, their stupidity, their ignorance, or their unscrupulousness. By political equality, Marxists mean equal rights, and by economic equality, as we've already said, they mean the abolition of classes. As for establishing human equality in the sense of equality of strength and abilities, physical and mental, socialists do not even think of such things. Political equality is a demand for equal political rights for all citizens of a country who have reached a certain age and who do not suffer from either ordinary or liberal professorial feeble-mindedness. The entire write-up is lovely. I highly suggest you go read it, but Lenin's TLDR point is this. Socialists want the abolition of classes and political equality, meaning equal rights. No one even mentions height differences or charisma or whatever. These are all straw men of socialism advanced by those that either don't understand socialism or have critiques so weak that they need to invent lies in order to have something to refute. As for his bringing the rich and poor closer together, reducing equality, blah, blah, blah point. Well, it's moot because inequality is rising in pretty much every single social democratic country in Europe.
It took me, I think it was 3 days. I was playing for 3 days last time I was trying to pick up Frog. Because what I wanted to do is I wanted to use it to build a base on the obelisk, which is what I plan on doing. Like I said, I'm pretty sure I've said that before. But yeah, I need a male 150 so I can start breeding.
So much for that, right? He goes on to sing the praises of social democracy despite missing the fundamental analysis of capitalism in a concessionary stage. The only reason social democracies rose was because the USSR was right next door, providing all those same social safeties and more. The second it was gone, the ruling class got to dismantling. Capitalists always want and need higher profits, so concessions will eventually be stripped away. Capitalism is an untenable system due to boom and bust cycles, environmental impact, the senseless pursuit of never-ending profit, perpetual unemployment in the form of a reserve army of labor, the falling rate of profit, imperialism. I can go on for much longer. Check out my relevant videos on why capitalism sucks and why socialism
I'm just going to put them in then.
Here.
I could.
He has this point he repeats on socially guided market economy a lot. Doesn't he realize that only profits guide markets? I mean, Vietnam is kind of an example to the contrary at times with a lot more nuance I don't have the energy to put in here. But I doubt he's advocating for that system. If it came down to make a profit and provide no safety net versus make a loss and provide a safety net, which do you think the capitalist-dominated social democracies would choose? The first, obviously, and not because they're cartoon villains, but because the capitalist economic system is built atop profit solely. If profit isn't made, the economy collapses and there will no longer be a state to provide that safety net. He also says free education means you can go study wherever you want. As if a job market isn't a thing in social democracies and people wouldn't be forced to enter professions that will have a decent salary as compared to passions that tend to be more creative and worse paying. This stuff is tiring because their analysis is just so good-hearted, I guess, and naive. It's just a shame they haven't realized they're wrong yet.
Now, here's where the critique actually defends social democracy over socialism. A totally socialist society, whether Marxist or utopian or anarchist or Leninist in the US would actually be impossible.
Damn.
Differentiating Marxist and Leninist is essentially pointless because I can assure you he's probably not aware of the nuances and entirely irrelevant in the modern era between the two in a theoretical sense, but this also requires substantiating. Why is it impossible? Because revolution as you see it currently isn't likely? To quote the lovely Luxemburg, before a revolution happens, it is perceived as impossible. After it happens, it is seen as having been inevitable. This is a work in progress, not something that falls from the sky. This is why agitation, organization, parties, etc. exist. The democratic capitalist revolutions also took tireless work, and royals and aristocrats of the time similarly held the vain and mistaken belief that they wouldn't ever be successful until they were.
But what wouldn't be impossible would be socializing certain elements of American society.
This, yet again, also needs to be substantiated. Attempts at socializing healthcare and education have been going on for decades in the US with no success in sight. Doesn't mean it's impossible, no, and especially if revolutionary rhetoric becomes more popular, the ruling class will change their tune real quick. That's basically the entire story with FDR and the New Deal. But again, socializing healthcare would be a concession that would be stripped at the edges slowly as working class movements weaken, like in every other instance in European social democratic history. I can recommend you some literature. Just a cursory glance through The Communist Necessity by Mofo et Paul would answer a lot of these questions for you.
One other argument from the right, which is they say it works in Sweden because Sweden is small and the US is big. That's part of why I believe that total socialism actually is not the path forward, but that there are socializable components which would work absolutely fine
That's
in
social
the United States.
democracy.
Big means socialism, no work is not an argument. The USSR was absolutely massive and had to do with a lot less, and still managed to do a pretty good job. Modern technology, communications, computers, and the internet would definitely make even more possible in the modern era.
So to sort of give you the highlights of why I'm not a socialist and I am a social democrat, I believe that a socially directed market economy that reduces income inequality and ensures a real standard of living for everybody is more realistic, and it's also more in line with human nature.
So, reason number one is I'm not up to date on income inequality statistics in modern social democracies, and a strawman argument of socialism debunked over a century ago. Color me surprised.
And I fundamentally, and this gets back to the real reason that I so vehemently oppose what we see going on in Venezuela and what we see and have seen in other places around the world, I do not believe, because I've seen no evidence, that an egalitarian, self-determining, free society will develop from an authoritarian apparatus, period.
You just haven't done the reading, that's all you said. The entire framing is wrong because it presupposes that social democratic capitalism is free and egalitarian, which is a mistaken belief already discussed. Check out my Problems of the Western Left video if you're still interested. Otherwise, you've already revealed to us that you're not the most educated on the topic of socialism, no shame in that. But that leads me to not have any reason to believe you'd be any more qualified to comment on socialist history or its conditions. This is less a concrete position on the superiority of social democracy and more a comforting ignorance draped in impotent appeals to precarious systems under no external pressure, unlike historic and current socialisms which were and have never been allowed to develop on their own terms. He signs off by saying he's open to dialogue. Well, so am I. If you're down, David, I'll at you and we can see if we can make something of a conversation on this topic going into the future. That's all for this time. Apologies, not as memey as usual, but the previous video would have satiated your appetite, I hope. If you enjoy my work, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Rebecca, Jamie Woodruff, Zayzene, ABR Soviet.
Alright, next one. What are we gonna watch now? America compared why other countries treat their people better.
For many
so
years
much
now,
better.
Conventional wisdom in our country has told us that if we want to understand the greatest threats facing the nation...
Go fuck off.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help me make more content like this, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. I'm going to say something that will probably offend many of my viewers. Let me preface this by saying that I, as an American, include myself in the following statement. Americans are quite possibly the most willfully ignorant people on the face of the planet. We have access to the sum total of all human knowledge, yet our understanding of the world rarely extends beyond our own country. And even then, the majority of Americans believe in a vision of the country that does not actually exist. It's not that we're stupid, we just tend to blindly accept that the US is the greatest place on Earth, and therefore don't see any reason to educate ourselves about the realities of the rest of the world. In this episode, we're going to pull back the curtain on how America actually compares to other countries, and consider why the richest country on Earth fails to treat its people with dignity and fairness. I'm going to provide a list of important topics, then for each item we'll compare the American experience with that of citizens from other nations. Hopefully by providing a side-by-side comparison, you'll be able to see the stark contrast between how most Americans see their country and how it really stacks up against the competition. To give you an idea of just how skewed the American perception of our country really is, let's start with a pretty shocking example. Compensation for what are considered low-skilled jobs. We'll take the quintessential American company, McDonald's. McDonald's is the world's largest restaurant chain by revenue. It operates in over 100 countries and serves over 69 million customers every day. As of 2018, McDonald's was the second largest private employer, with 1.7 million employees, behind Walmart's 2.3 million. How many times have you heard someone refer to McDonald's jobs or workers in a derogatory manner? For some reason, people who work at McDonald's are seen as inferior or lazy or have any number of other unfair and unkind assessments leveled at them. This probably stems from the old notion of flipping burgers being a job anyone can perform. But the animosity towards low-wage workers has grown significantly in the past few decades. And in America, McDonald's workers really do suffer a low wage. As of 2020, the average crew member at McDonald's makes $9 per hour. The average McDonald's cashier makes $8 per hour. The federal minimum wage in the United States is $7.25, a rate which has not been raised in over a decade, and which should not be considered a reasonable wage for any position, considering the fact that a full-time minimum wage worker cannot afford to rent a 2-bedroom apartment anywhere in the United States, and can't afford a 1-bedroom apartment in over 95% of US counties. Now, the all-too-common response to data like this is something like, well, yeah, it's not a hard job, you should just find a better one. Here's a simple question. Should any job, regardless of technical skill required, pay workers so little that they cannot afford to rent even the smallest place to live? Not to mention other necessities like utilities, food, and medicine. Absolutely not. That is inhumane and cruel, especially coming from the second largest employer in the richest country on the planet. Other notable objections include, McDonald's has to make a profit. If they pay their workers more, they might go out of business. First of all, if you can't pay your workers a fair wage, your company should not be in business. End of story. But again, McDonald's is not struggling to make ends meet. In 2019, McDonald's raked in $21 billion in revenue. But no matter how obvious the exploitation of low-wage workers, Americans are hell-bent on praising the very companies doing the exploiting. Take this article on Reader's Digest, for example. It's titled, "This is what McDonald's workers really get paid." You see that and think, oh, nice, finally some news showing how poorly these workers are compensated. Then you scroll down and nope, they're actually praising McDonald's, saying things like, the food chain is also great for paying their workers fairly, and McDonald's is one of the highest paying fast food chains in the United States. This level of sycophancy is insane. If $8 or $9 an hour is some of the highest pay in the industry, that doesn't indicate that McDonald's is paying fairly, it indicates that a massive chunk of the population is being paid poverty wages. This is where taking an international perspective is so critical. If all you see is feel-good stories about how well McDonald's workers are paid, you'll never know how badly American workers are actually being treated. Let's take the same company, the same position, but in a different country. Here's a McDonald's in Denmark. The average McDonald's worker in Denmark, for doing the same low-skill job, makes $22 per hour. Well, hold on, you hear Reader's Digest scream from across the Atlantic. McDonald's workers in America get paid vacation days after just a year of work. Wow, enticing. In Denmark, when you're hired at McDonald's, not only are you making nearly 3 times what you would make in an American Mickey D's, you also instantly have access to a full year of paid family leave and a pension. No slaving away for a year to prove your value to the company. You're hired and you're treated fairly. Simple as that. McDonald's can afford to compensate all their workers like this, but they won't, because US laws allow them to exploit American workers to the point where they're basically slaves, earning the bare minimum to survive, paying all of their income and often going into debt just to pay rent, and having no way to escape this vicious cycle because they're working such long hours. This is the case across all of America's low-wage jobs, of which there are many. The plight of the low-wage worker is incredibly dire, and all you have to do to understand that is look at how those same workers are treated in other wealthy countries. Let's move on to another topic, work-life balance. Fair wages are definitely part of this equation. If you're paid fairly, you don't need to work a second job, which will free up your time to be spent elsewhere. But we're going to focus on other metrics, specifically the length of the work week, vacation time, and parental leave. Let's start with the US. Most Americans would say that 40 hours per week is full-time. That seems to be the general consensus. But, in keeping with the country's exploitative labor practices, the hilariously named Fair Labor Standards Act does not actually define what qualifies as full-time. That's left up to the employer. Okay, why does this matter? Well, think of your past part-time jobs. Did you get any benefits? Healthcare, 401k? Probably not. Most benefits, when they're offered at all, are reserved for full-time employees. Companies don't want to provide benefits because they affect their bottom line. America is all about cutting costs, and providing workers with fair compensation is a cost. So, imagine you apply for a full-time job at Best Buy. You're offered the job, but they tell you they only have part-time positions, but they can give you almost full-time. They make it sound like they're doing you a favor, offering you more hours than normal part-time. But this is just another example of employers exploiting their workers. If you work 37 hours per week, you're essentially a full-time employee, but they don't have to provide you any sort of benefits. No healthcare, no vacation, nothing. This is a common practice. Companies will hire people, but keep them just below the threshold for full-time to avoid providing fair compensation. I've seen it happen. I used to work at Best Buy and they would do it all the time. And that's just the companies who are still trying to appear generous. Others will simply not offer benefits at all, or set their full-time positions at 50 or 60 hours per week. Sales positions are notorious for this. They'll often say, well, we expect you to work 40 hours, but all the top sellers are working 60 to 70 hours per week. This is coercion. They're trying to pressure you into working more hours to benefit them, and the compensation is never what they claim it will be.
So many good ones.
By allowing employers
not
to
that
define
bad.
full-time
Let
work,
me put you over
American
here.
workers are held captive by corporations, forced to either work absurd hours to qualify for full-time benefits, or find a second job to help cover the cost of things like health insurance. Both of these options lead to a terrible work-life balance, and as real wages have decreased and benefits have been offered less and less over the years, huge numbers of American workers have developed an unhealthy work-life balance. For example, in 1960, when workers had real bargaining power, only 20% of American women worked. Today, 70% of children live in households where both parents are working full-time. Where does all this lead? As of 2020, over 85% of American men and 66% of women work more than 40 hours per week. We work 137 more hours per year than Japanese workers, 260 more than the British, and 499 more hours per year than the French. Why do other countries have such a better balance? Because many of them have laws that cap the length of the full-time work week. Companies are required to pay their workers fairly and allow enough time off for employees to maintain a healthy work-life balance. That's not the case in the US. Vacation time is a similar story. Whereas many other countries mandate that employers provide paid vacation and sick days, the US does not. In every industrialized nation, workers get more paid vacation days and holidays than in the US. Here's a depressing graph to illustrate just how poorly we treat our workers. France 31, Spain 34, Austria 38, America 0. 0 paid vacation days, 0 paid holidays. And remember, these are the mandated figures. Every Austrian worker gets a minimum of 38 paid days off per year. Even in the worst possible employment situation, they'd still get 38 paid days off. In the US, many workers are lucky to get Christmas or Thanksgiving off at all, and the odds that it's a paid holiday, next to 0.
Yo, you guys having a good time? Let's bring this boat in right.
Let's move on to our final comparison, paid parental leave. Many Americans aren't even aware this is a thing, so let me explain. When an employee of a company has a child, sometimes they're offered parental leave, a period of time where they can stay home from work to bond with and take care of their new baby. This greatly benefits the employee, the child, and in the long run, the company, because the employee will be happier, less stressed, and more loyal to the company. Of course, offering paid parental leave doesn't benefit corporations in the short term. And if there's one thing that encapsulates the American business philosophy, it's short-term gains over all else. So it won't surprise you to learn that the US is the only industrialized nation on the planet that does not mandate some amount of paid parental leave. This may be shocking to my American viewers because being able to get paid to spend time with your newborn child sounds like an impossible dream in our dystopian labor market. And honestly, it probably is impossible in our current America. We're so invested in self-destructive capitalism that even suggesting the possibility of paid parental leave would put US politicians out of a job. That's not the case in the rest of the industrialized world. In fact, every other OECD nation, and even in many third world countries, new parents are guaranteed at least several weeks of leave. Let's take a look at a few of them. Ethiopia, a country with an annual gross national income of under $900 per person, offers 90 days of leave with 100% pay. Madagascar, 14 weeks at 100%. Afghanistan, 90 days. Denmark, 52 weeks. Norway, 56 weeks. France, 16 weeks at 100% pay for your first child, up to 26 weeks for your third, on top of 104 unpaid weeks. Lithuania, 52 weeks at 100%, plus an additional 52 weeks at 80%. Again, the United States does not mandate a single day of paid parental leave even for the mother, and the father is never considered. This means that workers in America have to choose to either pay the exorbitant cost of childcare or have one parent quit their job in order to take care of the child. These are both bad options, which often lead to economic precarity. But that doesn't matter to the companies employing American workers. Profit is the only thing that matters. Hopefully, seeing these labor practices compared like this has made it clear that not only is the US not living up to its claim to being the greatest nation on earth, but also that it consistently ranks poorly and often dead last in terms of labor metrics. Why is it that the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth can't pay their workers a fair wage, or provide healthcare, vacation time, or paid parental leave? You should realize by now that it's not that they can't, it's that they won't. Everything in America is beholden to the almighty dollar. Profit is the only motivator. If an action does not produce a greater profit, it will not be considered. Over the last few decades, Americans have watched as our livelihoods, our quality of life, and our dignity have all been stripped away by those who already make obscene amounts of money. Those in power say we're all in this together, but that couldn't be further from the truth. The ultra-wealthy and the world's largest corporations rely on Americans remaining ignorant. They rely on us accepting the lie that America is the greatest nation on earth, that it couldn't possibly get any better. All you have to do to shatter that lie is to take a look around the world. Other nations take care of their citizens. Even impoverished nations, or nations that we've bombed into oblivion, take better care of their people than the US does. American workers need to relearn the language of class struggle and work together to break the wheel of the capitalist machine. If we want to claim that the United States is the greatest place on earth, we need to make it that way. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is supported by my patrons on Patreon. This type of video, while very important, is something that sponsors won't touch. In order to pay the bills and keep this channel running, I rely on AdSense revenue, sponsors, and donations from generous viewers. By producing explicitly anti-capitalist content, I lose out on both sponsors and AdSense. If you enjoy the kind of videos I'm producing and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. You can find my Patreon page and join our growing Discord server at patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Welcome to Classful. We're going to be your new best friend this school year. We help teachers find great resources, simplify fundraising, and streamline communication.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. If you live in the United States, you already know who likes to talk about freedom and liberty the most. In the national contest over who gets to represent what values, the Republican Party, and conservatives in general, have monopolized the idea that their politics are the politics of freedom. Leave it to the left to kill our liberty in its fight for equality. We on the right, we stand for our hard-earned freedom. Unfortunately for the right, that couldn't be further from the truth. In this episode, we're going to cover a deeply left-wing idea: freedom. We'll look at its history as a political concept and how what constitutes freedom, and who gets to claim it as their own, has been perverted in only very recent history. But before we get to that, we need to start with a brief overview of the left and the right as political families. If you're new to politics, you've probably come across statements like these.
The left strive for an equal society and believe that the state should play a substantial role in people's lives. The right believe that a level of social inequality is inevitable and think that the government should have a limited role in people's lives and business. This is, as the right believes, that preserving personal freedom should be the government's main goal and should not impose too many rules on people's lives.
It's pretty common for introductory political classes and videos to differentiate the left and the right by the two values that their discourse seems to essentialize: equality and freedom, and then to pit these two values against each other to explain the conflict of politics. It's all very simple when people are just disagreeing over which value they prefer. What's hiding behind this quick and easy distinction, though, is a rich history of both freedom and equality as leftist political values, and the real conflict that animates politics. You probably already intuitively understand that this dichotomy between freedom and equality is just wrong. Conservatives have always been the party of lock her up, private prisons, increasing the police budget, and the death penalty. They're the party of who isn't allowed to get married, what women aren't allowed to do with their own bodies, who isn't allowed to vote, who's allowed in, and who isn't allowed to exist. For all their virtue signaling, freedom doesn't seem to guide their politics all that much. So what's going on here? Where does that disconnect come from? To figure that out, let's explore a history of the left and the right and the role freedom has played in that history. The use of the terms left and right to designate political families originates with the French Revolution. Back in the late 18th century, France revolted against its monarchy, and when it came time to decide what role the king would play in French society, those who supported the old regime sat on the right side of the National Assembly, and those who supported the revolution and the new republic sat on the left. Conservatives on the right, progressives on the left. Centuries later, as democratic political systems in France and elsewhere became more defined, they borrowed this imprecise terminology to draw rough lines between the conservatives and the progressives who came to represent the core ideas of these two groups. Hierarchy on the right, emancipation on the left.
With H&R Block, tax season feels just as good as all those other seasons.
You're filing yourself.
This is the origin of the modern left and right, but it is also a stopping point of a longer history of freedom as a political value. And that history goes much farther back, at least to Mesopotamia, the first Hebrews, and ultimately ancient Greece and Rome, where the word that would become liberty was first used as an antonym to slavery. To be free was to not be a slave. This original definition formed the basis of some of the first formalized political debates for which we have existing records. In other words, freedom transformed from an abstract concept to a political one. And at the core of this transformation were debates animated by two questions: who gets to be free, and what does that mean? A few answers begin to emerge. For Aristotle, a founding figure in the long history of political theory, freedom has many parts. In democracies specifically, freedom is both 1, ruling and being ruled in turn, and 2, the ability to live as one wishes without interference from others. These map quite cleanly to the way we still conceptualize freedom today, in negative and positive terms. Negative freedom usually takes the form of freedom from, as in freedom from obstacles or freedom from coercion. Positive freedoms are freedoms that can be formulated in freedom to statements,
Not worth it.
like freedom to act upon my free will. This distinction is relatively muddy, and many things can be formulated as one or the other more or less convincingly, but they make up the basis of political debates over freedom. On his end, Aristotle chose to formulate these freedoms in a political context by making negative freedom, freedom from coercion, tangible with his notion of equal and alternating rule, and positive freedom, freedom to, by ensuring one's ability to live as they please. For these conditions to be freedom, the very basis of a democratic society according to Aristotle, it is crucial that people must be equal in their political power. This is the variable that distinguishes democracies from other systems of government. Specifically, democracy is a system of popular sovereignty, in direct contradiction with a society where the more prosperous, the wealthy, can utilize their wealth as political power. Without a base level of equality in power, it is not a democracy. Aristotle argues this by saying that if no one has more power over others to a greater degree than anyone else does, no one is becoming a metaphorical slave to another. Remember that this question of slavery is incredibly central to early politics and the very meaning of liberty. With this theory of freedom, then, Aristotle reassures the people of ancient Greece that simply by creating a political organization, so long as it is democratic and equal, the Greeks have not made themselves slaves to their fellow citizens. On the contrary, government in this sense is emancipatory, not enslaving. Of course, this freedom and equality only very narrowly applied to citizens of democratic city-states, typically meaning non-enslaved men and hardly anyone else. Nonetheless, ancient Greek city-states did adopt these theories of freedom. Athens is perhaps the most famous example of this, where over time the average citizen, which, to be clear, still exclusively meant non-enslaved men, gained more and more control over their politics and therefore their lives. Athenians wrenched freedom from the hands of the elite, who made no effort to hide their disdain for this government by the poor, prompting at least one pro-democracy Athenian to declare that all men are created equal, and it is only the government that recognizes this truth that can guarantee freedom. This is the first attack on the false dichotomy between freedom and equality, all the way back in 300 BC. For democratic freedom to be realized, as Aristotle clearly states and the proper function of Athens and democracies demonstrated, there is a base conception of equality that must be ensured. Without it, freedom only applies to the fortunate, or not at all. But Aristotle doesn't stop there. He substantiates these relatively fungible concepts with a concrete example of freedom: leisure. One of the great tests of liberty is to be free to engage in leisurely activities, activities that bring pleasure, happiness, and are distinct from work, to have the freedom to do things for their own sake. Aristotle separates this freedom from democratic freedom so he can justify his preferred form of government, aristocracy. But this split ultimately doesn't matter. Leisure has just become enshrined as one of the measures of liberty. Keep this in mind as freedom continues to evolve. And freedom does evolve. Around the world, different cultures define their own conceptions of freedom, often in very similar ways. For example, in Indonesia, political liberty was defined in much the same terms as in ancient Greece, an antonymic relationship to slavery. The story of freedom, at least in the West, gets picked up in the Renaissance, during which humanists broke with medieval traditions and returned to ancient Greek and Roman texts, like the works of Aristotle. These writings became course materials for students living during the time, and with that, the concept of political freedom was revived once again. The democratic ideal, when compared to the feudal tyranny most Europeans were living under, began to appeal to more and more of the general public, eventually materializing violently in the Atlantic revolutions. Brandished like revolutionary flags, the slogan "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity" of the French Revolution hardly goes unnoticed in this period. The idea that freedom meant breaking with the regime of monarchs, lords, and the oppression of the commoners was an all too natural idea for the revolutionary masses who were impoverished with little to no recourse to their own self-determination. This sentiment of people being owed liberty carried across the world in the American and Haitian revolutions, where liberty and equality went hand in hand. After all, how could the Haitian people ever be free if they were enslaved? How could they be free if they were dominated? How could they ever be free if they were not equal? The revolution proved that they too could enjoy liberty, and it arrived only once they acquired equal status. Around the world, revolutionary freedom was demanded and subsequently declared. Unsurprisingly, this frightened the elites. The period of terror that followed the French Revolution gave rise to an anti-democratic discourse that led to democratic repression, notably in the Napoleonic regime. Liberalism and conservatism alike were developed or resurged and came to dominate political discourse, concluding that democracy was ultimately dangerous to freedom, not its most valid expression. Nominally, these debates focused on the protection of the rights of minorities, but in practice, the greatest animating fear for anti-democratic politicians was that democracy opened the door to economic redistribution. In their minds, curtailing democracy was a perfectly legitimate goal if it upheld the safety of the class system. For this to happen, freedom had to be reframed by early liberal thinkers. Away from its origin as self-governance in a society of political equals, freedom became individualized. Parroting the arguments that had upheld the monarchy for so long, conservatives began to argue that freedom was best preserved under a benevolent and disinterested ruler or laws that made economic domination invisible. In pseudo-democratic societies, this was achieved by delinking institutions from popular power, or by curtailing it outright with greater state violence. For this sentiment to be catalyzed in the US, Americans had to wait until the abolition of slavery and the Cold War.
Hey guys, this is Jonathan at Turtlebox, and we are here today to talk about waterproofness. Your Turtlebox is 100% waterproof. As long as this cap right here is totally sealed, you're good to go. Your ports right there are an open hole into your box, so if you're around water, please guys, make sure that this is snug on there. Every other opening in the box is totally sealed off. So I'm going to show you guys here. We're going to start some music. Go ahead and dip us in the water all the way down, come back up. Look at that, totally waterproof. Something you'll notice, if you get your turtle box totally wet like this, if a wave hits it or if it gets tossed in a pool, a lot of times water will get stuck behind this tweeter right here. Trick to that, just blow it out. Just give it a nice firm blow there, it'll be totally fine. Everything will sound normal again. So that is a great way to listen to music. Another thing a lot of people like to do, and this is acceptable, is the turtle box will float on its back. and that's totally fine. Again, as long as that port cap is sealed.
At the end of the Civil War, Democratic disinterest reached its peak among the American elite. Faced with a newly liberated population of Black Americans, the idea that freedom belonged to the masses was heavily resisted with a slew of anti-democratic policies intended to curtail the freedom of the formerly enslaved to self-government and self-sufficiency. In its place, economic self-interest became cloaked in the value of freedom. To be free was to be successful, to mind your own business, not to achieve political equality or break down structural impediments to your freedom with the power of the collective. That was no longer an acceptable definition of freedom. Although prominent American political figures like Eugene Debs and FDR, alongside massive social labor movements, resisted this definition of individualized freedom and market domination, the final nail in the coffin came with the Cold War. The Cold War pitted the supposedly free against the unfree world. And once that battle had been won by the neoliberal West, its vision of freedom came to dominate political language. Freedom became impossible to disentangle from capitalism. While it's conceptually tempting to see this as the victory of one form of freedom over another, that is not the case. Capitalism and freedom have a purely adversarial relationship. Despite constantly being told that the two terms are synonymous, a capitalist regime all but eliminates freedom in economic matters, and so by extension, in social affairs. Of course, defenders of this system will say this is not the case. After all, capitalism provides us daily with the freedom to make personal decisions as consumers. Not only is this form of freedom incredibly limited, the great majority of our economic system is demonstrably unfree for most people. We see this play out most clearly in the domain of work. While capitalism sells us the idea of workers as consumers, who get to select from a catalog of meaningless jobs for the way to spend the majority of their waking hours, the exact opposite is true. People are forced into jobs for wages that rarely ever justify their efforts, for hours they do not choose, and in conditions they can't improve. Sure, we're free to not take a job we don't like, but on the other side of that decision is an economy where everything essential has been privatized. Your home, your food, your water and electricity, the services that you need to live, like hospital care. Every part of your basic survival requires you to accept this bad deal. There's no freedom between the choice of work and death, and our capitalist system makes that clear. Work lifts us out of a poverty manufactured by a system where jobs are the entry ticket to bare survival, and any form of economic security is rare.
I could just
Today,
upload it, right?
the majority of Americans can't scrape
build a
together
lot.
$400
I
for an
could build it on
emergency
the,
expense. And when the average
Red Hub
ambulance ride
first
will
and then
cost
go
you
to the Green Hub.
$800, you're in trouble before you even get to the hospital, which will then heap on tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. And once people are locked into the environment of wage labor, things hardly get better. Part of the contract of a job allows employers to set unreasonable standards for workers, surveil their employees, deny them basic necessities like bathroom breaks. Any deviation from this complete control comes with the
on the
threat
server,
of being
goddamn.
thrown back into unemployment, with
was
all
in the
the
server
dangers
too.
to your life that entails. Although it is the defenders of this system who rally around freedom, they have no problem violating it once you enter into a contract you were coerced into in the first place. When individual freedoms are allowed to dominate collective and democratic freedoms, the only freedom that is actually protected is the freedom of the wealthy to persecute the worse off. And that's not where this ends. There are, of course, the many ways our supposed freedom as consumers is infringed upon by capitalism's natural monopolies who happily jack up prices on essentials like life-saving medication. But even that barely scratches the surface. As you'll recall from earlier in this episode, one of the tests of liberty for Aristotle was the ability to enjoy leisure time. Leisure, in a sense, is a form of freedom that distinguishes human liberty from coercion and constraint, notably in the domain of work. As you can expect from a system that places such dramatic constraints on your life and such an emphasis on work as capitalism, the place of leisure is greatly marginalized. Freedom is marginalized. Leisure is restricted to only a few days of the week, and only to the very most fortunate. Few are the people who have the energy after a day of hard work to enjoy music and poetry as Aristotle did, to read a good book, to exercise, to take pleasure in life. And when you do get the chance, it's usually to recharge for the upcoming week. Leisure does not have a central place in a capitalist system because its enjoyment alone does not drive profits. In a society where work takes up most of our waking hours, most of our energy, and work is the only means by which we can guarantee our security, leisure is a luxury. Freedom is a luxury. The reason I am this insistent on the harms to freedom a capitalist system produces is because there are better alternatives. Under socialist organizations of the economy, the economic coercion seen under capitalist regimes virtually disappears, and freedom takes its place. This is a product of the more complete understanding of freedom on the left. The leftist conception of freedom hinges on two things. First, the ability one has to make decisions free from coercion, which critically includes constraints like acute precarity, lack of resources, and economic coercion, unlike the limited conception of coercion as only coming from governments and individuals in the conservative definition. Second, as the history of the left-wing struggle for liberty demonstrates, freedom is also a product of democratic self-governance. Since a socialist economy is based on prioritizing the provision of food, water, shelter, and medicine for all, not blindly following the profit motive or depriving people of these basic needs, eliminating the great majority of resource constraints, and granting workers democratic control over the economy, it actually delivers on the promise of freedom. Without poverty and an undemocratic economy standing in your way, you are free to live out your life as you see fit. Liberty and freedom are left-wing ideals. No matter how hard the global neoliberal consensus tries to convince us otherwise, there is no hiding this simple fact. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that this kind of content is made possible by my patrons on Patreon. When I decided to make the shift from general interest stuff to more radical political content, I knew I ran the risk of sinking my channel and losing my ad revenue and sponsors. These days, it's pretty hard to get a sponsor on my videos. I have one reliable one, and they're great, but for the most part, I'm having to rely on the generous support of viewers like you. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, as well as access to our patrons-only Discord server. It's a great place to hang out, chat with other like-minded people, or learn about socialist theory in our book club. I'm also pretty active in the server, so you're always welcome to ping me to ask a question or just say hi.
We'll do this one. This one next.
This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get free access to Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers, when you sign up for CuriosityStream at the link below. When you look at a map of the world, a few questions immediately come to mind, like what's this, what's that, and of course, what's the deal with all the blue stuff? I don't need to tell you that that's just how looking at a map goes. We've all been there. Humanity has been making maps for at least 5 years, and there's no denying that they are important to us. Whether it's getting us from our homes to the nearest coffee shop, or from there to another coffee shop, we use maps for a million different things. Sometimes, we use maps to answer important political questions, like in this clip, for example.
Should we consider military action against North Korea?
I believe so.
And where is North Korea?
But sometimes, we use maps not to answer questions like, where's that place I want to bomb for some reason, or how many Lebanons can fit inside Syria once you've already included Rhode Island, but rather to ask questions. That's the case for maps like this one, which prompts the question, how come all these countries are way poorer than all these? There are many answers to this question, but the one we'll focus on in this video is imperialism. While many different factors can explain in one way or another the inequality between countries, like geography, climate, natural resources, incidence of disease, and so on, it is imperialism, the need for capitalism to expand and subject more of the world to its control and logic, that can most convincingly explain why these differences have persisted in a world where tremendous material wealth has already been achieved. Unlike other explanations, using the framework of imperialism to understand the global divide between rich and poor allows us to see that it is not by accident or fate that some countries are kept poor. It's by choice. Somebody's choice. In other words, imperialism explains the global balance of power and poverty. But to understand this and the root of that power, we need to go back in time a little bit. Our modern world order and its rich-poor divide is undeniably rooted in the history of slavery and colonialism. While the history of the world is long and diverse, with each area and culture having its own record of the sequence of important events that defines it, a common historical juncture for many places is the white guys showing up and ruining it. That's the case for basically every modern country that's not here, and practically entire continents like Africa, which, despite its incredible diversity of cultures and characteristics, has been pretty uniformly subjected to the violence and damaging effects of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Before the arrival of the Europeans, Africa was a continent with tens of thousands of cultures, some organized in ways that are easily recognizable to modern Western eyes with empire or state-like structures, and others that operated on completely different societal models without a good Western analogy. While the conventional narrative about Africa is one of a backwards continent that was quote-unquote civilized by European colonialism, a horrible and flat-out wrong justification for the atrocities I'll get to in a bit, Africa was actually developing side by side with much of the rest of the world for centuries. Historians note, for example, the advanced agricultural techniques like terracing, crop rotation, green manuring, mixed farming, and regulated swamp farming that made African topsoil rich and fertile for centuries, and the domestication of plants like millet, rice, and yams that was widespread on the continent. While this agriculture was not as productive as that in Europe and Asia, this was probably because land was abundant, and the organization of production around family units instead of feudal lords meant that self-sufficiency didn't require the same maximization that we saw in Europe, which ironically eventually led to the degradation of European soil, where Africa had achieved a more sustainable model. Then there were material goods. While Europe's Industrial Revolution had brought with it an abundance of goods, mass-produced in shiny new factories, especially textiles, African goods like leather, copper, iron, and cloth produced at the same time were praised for their craftsmanship, their durability, and their quality. This is not to say that because it was happening at a smaller scale that Africa did not experience abundance. Like Europe, Africa produced surplus, and used this surplus to trade, with complex economies emerging between the three continents of Europe, Asia, and Africa prior to the advent of slavery and colonialism. What I'm trying to say here is that while there were qualitative differences between the countries that are now considered the Global North and the Global South, it's not always clear that these differences made the Global South worse off. Some of the first European explorers of the time say as much in their accounts of the continent, which I'm not going to read out loud because they're long, but I'll put an example on screen if you don't trust me that Europeans thought Africa was pretty cool and not, quote, underdeveloped like we might say today. Like everywhere else in the world, development in Africa was incredibly inconsistent. But even this cursory overview of African development before colonialism and slavery reveals that Africa, and more generally, non-Western geographies, were not predestined to occupy their role at the bottom of the global order like we might assume today. But this eventually changed. Back in Europe, things shifted, and for that, we can look to the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. The simultaneous advent of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism produced stuff, yes, but more importantly, it produced new needs and new structures of power. Specifically, capitalism produced the need to grow no matter what, and the power of the state to make that happen. As you know, capitalism produces things by committing people to wage labor. Instead of meeting your needs individually, as a community, or through trade, all of which happened under previous economic models, individual needs now had to be met by working for someone else, and getting a little money back for your labor. A few people owned things like factories, but the majority of people did not. And increasingly dispossessed of land and other means to self-determine, they traded their time and labor on the machines owned by others for money they would then spend on the products they had themselves made.
I love it. It's so
That's
great.
all well and good for the capitalists who owned these machines and factories. But eventually, they started running out of space. Domestic markets are not big enough to satisfy capitalists' incessant demand for growth. And since stagnation means death, European capitalists and the states they increasingly controlled started expanding beyond Europe in search of new ways to grow their businesses.
Your friends are helping you renovate. You know you owe them dinner, right?
Delicious Schwann's home deliveries in the freezer.
That freezer? Go from freezer to oven to done. Order today at schwans.com.
While spreading out, they found America. Or, more accurately, first they found the Caribbean. With its agreeable climate great for growing crops and its supplies of gold and silver, the Americas were ripe for businesses to expand their productions and their profits. But they ran into a problem. There wasn't a big enough European labor force to exploit these new lands, and many of the people who lived there were either brutally murdered by the Europeans taking it over, or by the diseases they brought with them. So Europeans found another solution. Using their advantages in ships and weaponry and opening new trade relations, Europeans bought slaves. They made this new land profitable not by their own hands, but with the forced labor of slaves first captured to convey in words how brutal this practice was, and I don't really want to use some of the most graphic images of the time. But needless to say that much of the wealth that Europe acquired by these means, and that today places it among the top half of the world, was achieved through the control and orchestration of this incredibly profitable and incredibly violent process. Estimates vary wildly about how much this benefited Europe in concrete terms, and conversely, how damaging the slave trade was to Africa. While we know that between 12.5 and 20 million people were ripped from the African continent between the 15th and 20th century, estimates about the kinds of reparations that would offset this loss, to use very callous economic terms, range from 100 to nearly $800 trillion. In no uncertain terms, however, the slave trade was brutal for Africa and its path to development, and beneficial, if only by comparison at the very least, to the countries that orchestrated it. The combined effects of basing an entire economy on losing people that would otherwise produce domestically, the violence of the European forces, and the sheer loss of brilliant minds to death or kidnapping has no modern equivalent. And this gives us a first piece of evidence for the North-South wealth gap. But eventually, the slave trade transformed. Deficits in European nations were no longer met by trade and settler colonies in the West. In other words, Europe needed something new to feed the capitalist growth imperative. Europe thus began converting many of its operations to a more direct control over land and resources. In short, colonialism. From gilded rooms thousands of miles away, European nations cut up the world amongst themselves, most notably during the Berlin Conference that launched the quote, "Scramble for Africa." The result was another map, but in more concrete terms, a new increase in violence. European companies and governments set up shop in their new colonies at the barrel of their improving weaponry, and began exploiting their resources, land, and labor forces even more brutally than they did their workers back home. Attracted by the high profits of the colonies, a product of the lack of established capital, the low price of land, the low wages of workers, and the cheapness of raw materials, capitalist countries had found a new solution to their domestic economies becoming overripe. Here again, we saw abject horrors I don't really want to show you, mostly because YouTube will age restrict this video. Starvation, whippings, and mutilations were all popular methods of colonial control after the tremendous violence of conquest had already been exacted. The need to achieve growth and avoid capitalist collapse convinced Europeans to commit atrocities in the rest of the world on a scale that's hard to even comprehend. On the economic side of things, the cost of this period are once again hard to estimate, but not impossible. One economist, for example, has calculated that British colonialism cost India $45 trillion in today's currency between 1765 and 1938. But that's an estimate. A very educated one, but an estimate nonetheless. On the other side of the world, however, we can get at least one exact number. The cost of Haitian independence. Independence from French colonial rule after the Haitian Revolution cost the country 150 million francs, 5 times France's annual budget, and $21 billion in modern currency. That is a verifiable $21 billion head start for France / a $21 billion handicap for Haiti, which doesn't even count all the wealth extracted by the colonial process itself. If we focus on the European side of the equation, colonies were often very profitable. According to historian Walter Rodney, in the mid-1950s, British investments in South Africa were estimated at £860 million and yielded a stable profit of 15%, or £129 million every year. Similarly, De Beers Consolidated Mines made a profit that was both phenomenal and consistently high, between $26 million and $29 million throughout the 1950s. In other words, if slavery hadn't driven a big enough wedge between the rich and the poor, colonialism would. But colonialism would eventually end. That is, if you don't count the 17 official colonies still recognized by the UN, like Guam and French Polynesia, or the many more colonies that don't get put on official lists because they make ruling countries uncomfortable. Nonetheless, we have a lot fewer colonies today than we used to. The mid-20th century was a period of success for a number of anti-colonial revolutions. Many countries won their right to independence in these revolutions, and to most, this is where the story ends. It seems like the domination of colonial powers is over. Yeah, Europe screwed over the rest of the world for centuries, but then they stopped. So then, why is there still a gap between rich and poor? Can't all these countries just pull themselves up by their bootstraps? No. It's not just that after years of colonialism and slavery, the West had a head start and the Global South had a handicap. When it was forced to relinquish the direct control of colonial rule, the West made sure it would never have to let go of the economic power it had built for centuries. In other words, the formal end of colonialism wasn't really the end after all. Like credits after a Marvel movie, there was more to come. Within a global capitalist economy, burgeoning independent economies were in a tough spot. After decades of being used and exploited, former colonies had very little wealth still in their control. But they needed to trade with the countries that had formerly exploited them for trillions and never paid reparations back. Trade is how most countries can secure basic needs. Enter the IMF, the World Bank, and structural adjustment programs. The IMF, World Bank, GATT, which became the WTO, and even some Western countries directly told newly independent countries that if they wanted to be included in the international economy, and perhaps even get a loan to get them started, they would have to follow a strict set of rules. They would have to drop any tariffs on foreign goods, privatize any national industry, open their country to foreign investment, and in every respect minimize the role of the state. In sum, they had to open the doors to unbridled Western capitalism, with pretty awful results.
File online with H&R Block and tax season feels just as good as all those other seasons.
It's the maximum refund we always wanted.
And we did it ourselves, just like we made these gingerbread tax men.
It's not fair that I don't get to do taxes.
Upload last year's return to switch to H&R Block.
What is this capitalist propaganda?
Not only were the loans really for the benefit of Western organizations, a loan has to be paid back with interest after all, the rest of the requirements often had and continue to have devastating effects. These measures ended up inviting many foreign-owned companies into former colonies. Without the ability to level the playing field on international competition with protectionist tariffs, or large-scale investments into national industries, infrastructure, and common goods, Global South countries were taken over by multinational industries. In the forced competition for shrinking export markets that the liberalization of trade produced, the Global South was coerced into turning to Western companies and their direct capture of national resources. Today, as an example, Canadian companies operate 75% of the world's mining companies, many of which are located in Africa and in Latin America. In effect, resources that are located in the Global South and extracted by the workers of the Global South were forcibly opened up to, and ultimately produced profit for, Canadian business interests, not for these exploited countries. This is why the Global South is still so poor, because it's not just Canada. In just about every country in the Global South, in almost every economic sector, unprocessed natural resources leave the country's borders, extracted by low-wage workers. They're then processed in the Global North into manufactured products, which in turn are sold back at a higher price to meet the Global South's basic needs. Resources and profits go out, expensive goods and foreign companies come in. Colonialism by the state has been largely recycled into colonialism by businesses and their friendly international institutions. One 27-year-old Cuban lawyer described how this process worked out in Cuba in the 1950s. A country that was no longer a colony of either Spain or the US, but still very much felt like it was. 85% of the small farmers in Cuba pay rent and live under the constant threat of being dispossessed from the land that they cultivate. More than half of the best cultivated land belongs to foreigners. In Oriente, the largest province, the lands of the United Fruit Company and West Indian Company join the north coast to the southern one. There are 200,000 peasant families who do not have a single acre of land to cultivate to provide food for their starving children. We export sugar to import candy. We export hides to import shoes. We export iron to import plows. In short, what the structural adjustment programs and the international capitalist economy offered the Global South was predatory inclusion. Exclusion from international trade could have been deadly to these countries impoverished by centuries of extraction, violence, and exploitation. So even a deal that sucked and pulled profits to the Global North was often sold as better than the alternative. While some of these programs have been accompanied by economic growth in the global south, it is a much smaller growth than reflects the work done by poor countries, since most of the profit leaves for the north. And what growth does stay domestic mainly falls into the hands of the global south's wealthy, who willingly collaborate with foreign companies for a cut of the profit. Today, these practices continue in full swing. Colonialism never really went away. In summary, the poverty of the world today is not an accident. It's the product of centuries of subjugation to imperialist forces, at the root of which was the need for capitalism to expand beyond the borders of Europe and the means to inflict tremendous violence on the poor. That this system continues today is no accident. It's what makes the rich and powerful more money. As long as there is no economic challenger strong enough to end this system, capitalism will continue to rob the poor for the benefit of the wealthy. In this episode, we talked about the global south as a whole, but we specifically looked at Africa.
I forgot about
If this video was interesting
stamina.
to you and you'd like to learn more about some of the wonders created on the African continent, I highly recommend you check out Planet of Treasures Africa on CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. They've got thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. As I've shared with you all many times before, YouTube doesn't treat its creators very well, especially channels with content like mine. That's why some of my creator friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. CuriosityStream has supported our efforts from day one, so we're super happy to be able to offer this bundle deal, and get you guys access to Nebula basically for free. Nebula is home to content from all your favorite YouTubers, all completely ad-free. Between the two platforms, there really is something for everyone. And by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content like my original series, The New F Word, which YouTube would never allow on its platform. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel, and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous content by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Southridge Dental is proud to be a 3-time People's Choice Award winner here in the Tri-Cities. Come see why more people choose Southridge Dental. Visit us in our brand new location at 2431 South Quillen Place in Kennewick.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. Here's a parliament building being shelled by its president. Here's a starving Russian. And here's Mikhail Gorbachev with a big old pizza pie. This week, we're talking about liberal shock therapy.
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
This is the USSR. Back in the 20th century, the USSR was a country. Now, not so much. And the history of this transition has typically been told one specific way. As you probably already know, in the West, the end of the USSR is a story of inevitable triumph, a sort of teleological proof of the superiority of capitalism and the definitive nail in the coffin for any kind of socialist project. You'll certainly have experienced this yourself, but all over America and in Western countries in general, people are taught pretty early on about events like the fall of the Berlin Wall or Reagan's speech by the Brandenburg Gate. From these moments, the story goes, came the inevitable end of the USSR, of the Cold War, and to some, even of history itself. The story is usually told as though it couldn't have gone any other way. Capitalism was always going to win in the end. It's a very Marvel movie kind of way to tell history. For most people, then, the period following the dissolution of the USSR has been folded neatly into the US's overarching narrative for the 20th and 21st centuries. It's a narrative of manifest destiny, where the US is the vanguard of democracy for the rest of the world and extends freedom and peace and justice benevolently to all who suffer under the yoke of tyranny. In this narrative, there is democracy on one side and communism on the other. And the US prides itself on bringing democracy everywhere it goes, including in Russia. But as you can probably expect from all the other times the US has quote-unquote brought freedom and democracy to other countries, that whole narrative doesn't really line up with what actually happened. The end of the Soviet Union was not the arrival of democracy to the former Soviet countries, Russian capitalism was not the product of a democratic reawakening, and it was certainly not inevitable. The whole transition period between the Soviet era of Russia to its modern capitalist iteration was, in reality, a time of brutally anti-democratic violence, massive and immediate misery for millions, and the beginning of a new period of insecurity. And it all started with a process called shock therapy. As you might already know, in economics, shock therapy is the process of suddenly transitioning from a planned economy to a capitalist economy. Said differently, shock therapy is the abrupt, simultaneous, and top-down implementation of multiple capitalist economic principles where they once did not exist. The kinds of policies implemented are usually centered around your typical capitalist stuff like privatizations, as well as things like removing price controls, opening the domestic economy to international capital, and of course, austerity politics. The goal of shock therapy is to bring in rugged, quote-unquote, free market, neoliberal capitalism quickly and at pretty much any cost. It's called shock therapy by its advocates to try to evoke a positive, almost medical notion of economic transition. Something like ripping off a band-aid. A little shock at first, but an overall therapeutic outcome in the end. In reality though, shock therapy is about as gentle and medical as a bath with a toaster. And it can hardly be said to have cured any of the countries where it's been implemented.
Hey buddy, how are you?
Biore blemish patches.
Hey, I hope you have a good night, buddy.
Visible results.
Thank you for stopping by.
But that's not all. The term shock therapy has
I'm
more
over
recently
100
come to have a sort of double
kills.
meaning.
I'm like
Not only does the
111.
shock part of shock therapy evoke
Almost
the
level
sudden
80
pace of change
fire
and the
making.
electric violence of the whole process, as we've already covered, it also captures the, let's say, convenient use of shocking events to push capitalism through at breakneck speed. In the words of Naomi Klein, shock therapy is the brutal tactic of using the public's disorientation following a collective shock. Wars, coups, terrorist attacks, market crashes, or natural disasters to push through radical pro-corporate measures. So,
Skills during the
what did all this look
weekends
like
for
in
quests.
Russia?
Okay, fair enough.
For
fair
starters, in order to bring shock therapy to Russia, the idea of democracy had to be severely, let's say, reinterpreted. Following a wave of liberalization under the last president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the continuing effects of the Cold War, the USSR was suddenly, illegally, and undemocratically dissolved from within. Boris Yeltsin, then president of Russia, a republic within the USSR, signed an accord with the heads of two other Soviet republics to mutually recognize each other's independence. The leaders of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia all sat at a table, called themselves and each other independent countries, and then they just were. At the end of the day, to be a country, you really only need to say you are and find another country to agree with you. Just like that, the Soviet Union was functionally over, since without the U,
right here.
that was pretty much it for the SSR. A couple weeks later, then,
Do I have 10
Gorbachev
minutes?
resigned as leader of the USSR, and the Supreme Soviet, the equivalent of a parliament or a congress, announced the formal dissolution
Oh,
of
it's right
the
there.
Union. I summarized that pretty quickly, and that's partly because things happened really fast in real life, too. The sudden dissolution of the USSR really caught Soviet citizens by surprise, since just a couple months earlier, the USSR had held a countrywide referendum in which 80% of the population voted overwhelmingly in favor of preserving the Union, with some reforms to how it would function. Close to 80% of Soviet citizens wanted to keep the USSR around, including large majorities in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, the same countries that would announce their independence. In other words, the dissolution was not the fruit of some democratic process, it just kind of happened. One day the USSR was unified, then it was multiple countries, and then it stopped existing. What was left in its wake was a cluster of nations, and most importantly for this video, the new Russian Federation, led by liberal, capitalist, and nationalist president Boris Yeltsin. To be clear, this summary skips so many important events. But this video is about liberal shock therapy, not the dissolution of the USSR, so we gotta keep moving. And speaking of, keep moving is exactly what the Russian Federation did. Using the shock of the sudden collapse of the USSR, Yeltsin began pushing through more capitalist reforms in the newly born Russian Federation. He brought in capitalist institutions like the IMF, as well as capitalist economists like Jeffrey Sachs, more on him later, to help radically transform the Russian economy with the goal of bringing neoliberal capitalism in fast. And it started very early. The final month of the USSR's existence was December 1991, and by January of 1992, shock therapy was unleashed. First, price controls on consumer goods were dropped almost entirely, leading to an immediate 250% increase in price of basic necessities. Then came the layoffs and the hyperinflation. Unemployment skyrocketed by 56%. GDP fell 14.5% in a single year. Industrial production declined by almost 20%. Inflation ballooned to a ridiculous 1,354%, and real incomes were cut in half. The government cut spending on education and health, and between 1989 and 2002, deaths increased by 12.8%, and life expectancy for men declined by a full 6 years between 1991 and 1994. For reference, the drop in life expectancy due to COVID is about 1 year in the US. But that's not all. According to Tony Wood, an author on the transition to modern Russia, the ILO classified 85% of Russia's citizens as under the poverty line in 1992, which the Yeltsin government swiftly corrected, quote-unquote, to a teeny tiny 35%, or in other words, 1 in 3 people. And all of this, mind you, after the USSR stopped being at war with the world's largest economic and military power. This humanitarian crisis happened not during a violent, paralyzing war, but during a time of relatively unprecedented peace for Russia. These reforms and crises were accompanied with a decree from Yeltsin allowing anyone to sell anything at any time with no permit anywhere in Russia, prompting recently impoverished Russians to fill the streets in makeshift bazaars selling family heirlooms, personal belongings, and really anything they could to make ends meet. Perversely, this was commented on by Jeffrey Sachs, the economist leading the shock therapy project in Russia, as evidence of spontaneous market activity, as though people were being good little capitalists and not desperately trying to salvage what they could to stave off hunger. Unsurprisingly, as a consequence of this whole mess, organized crime found a welcoming home in the chaotic and deregulated environment of capitalist transition, leading, according to multiple accounts, to the development of the Russian mafia. But still, that's not all. We haven't even gotten to the privatizations. In 1992 alone, 47,000 state companies were privatized, a number that nearly doubled to 90,000 by the end of the following year. Companies formerly integrated into the planned economy were cut up into shares and offered for sale to the Russian people. Well, that is, in theory. Unsurprisingly, this process was done in a quick and dirty way that completely screwed over Russian people immediately. To privatize the economy, Soviet industries within the planned economy were available for purchase in shares. Russians would receive a voucher, worth about $20, with which they could technically buy shares in privatized companies, or if they wanted, they could just resell them. As common sense would suggest, when you're starving, a share isn't worth as much as cash. But regardless of what Russians did with these vouchers, it was almost always a losing investment. Behind Yeltsin's rhetoric of creating a society of, quote, millions of owners, was the reality that Russian capitalism was being built to look like every other capitalism, top-heavy. Like a shampoo bottle. Like when you flip it over to get that last little bit of shampoo from the bottom by getting it to the top. You already know what top-heavy means, I don't know why I felt like making an analogy. In any case, only 14% of companies privatized during the transitional period were ever available at public auction or for public stock purchase. Most privatizations went to insiders, or company managers, people who could take advantage of the new capitalist system effectively. Thus, in a very short amount of time, Russian capitalism caught up with its peers.
Alright, I'm actually just gonna cut it right here. I might be on tomorrow, depending on where I stand. I don't know. I might be on the next day either.